She was the only one left standing in the ashes of everything he destroyed, and when he rode up expecting silence, she gave him war. This is the story of Mara Vale, a woman with nothing left to lose, a king who didn't yet understand what he'd done, and a truth so dangerous that an entire empire tried to bury it alive. If you've ever been counted out, left behind, or told that someone like you doesn't matter, stay until the very end, because this one is for you. Drop the name of your city in the comments below, hit that like button, and let's begin. The fire had been burning for 3 days. Not the violent, hungry kind of fire that consumes in a single roaring night and leaves nothing but black bones behind. This was something slower, meaner, the kind of fire that lingers in the timber of a roof beam long after the flame has passed, smoldering deep in the grain of the wood, exhaling smoke and thin ghost-pale threads that curl upward into a sky the color of a bruise. It was the fire of aftermath, the fire of something irreversible. Brindle Hollow had been home to 412 people. Mara Vale knew that number the way she knew her own heartbeat, because she had been the one to count them. Every harvest season she walked the village rolls with the head man, marking births and deaths in the leather-bound ledger kept beneath the hearthstone of the community hall. She knew which families had new children and which had empty chairs. She knew which elders had made it through another winter and which had slipped away quietly in the cold. 412. Now there was one. She stood at the edge of what had been the market square, ankle-deep in gray powder that had once been barrels of winter wheat, her boots leaving prints in the ash like some final solitary record of human presence. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, tangled and singed at the ends. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that had dried to a rust-colored line, and her hands, the hands she'd used to drag 3 people from burning buildings before the soldiers drove her back at spear point, were wrapped in strips torn from her own undershirt. She wasn't crying. She had cried for the first 18 hours. She'd screamed into the hollow shell of what had been the baker's house when she found the Aldrich family's handprint scorched into the doorframe. She'd fallen to her knees in the mud at the edge of the eastern well when she understood that the dark, terrible thing floating at the bottom of it wasn't debris. She had wept until there was nothing left inside her that was soft, and then something had calcified in the center of her chest. Not hardness exactly, but density, like iron cooling in a mold. She had stopped being a grieving woman. She had become something else entirely. On the 3rd morning, she heard the horses. Not the frightened, scattered sound of villagers fleeing on stolen mounts. These were war horses, massive, iron-shod animals trained to move in formation, their hooves striking the ground in a rhythm so disciplined it sounded almost musical. She counted the beats without meaning to. 12 horses at the vanguard. More behind, the rolling vibration of wagon wheels, the distant jangle of armor. The king had come to inspect his work. Mara did not run. She had thought about it in the long, silent hours between finding the last body and watching the first gray light of the 3rd morning bleed across the horizon. She had thought about slipping into the thornwood to the north, moving through the old game trails she'd known since childhood, disappearing into the frontier wilderness that even the crowned soldiers thought twice about entering. She could survive out there. She knew how to read weather in the clouds and water in the earth. She knew which roots were edible in winter and how to build a shelter that the wind couldn't find. But something had stopped her. Not fear of being caught, not even grief, though the grief was enormous, a weight she carried in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading out to touch everything. What stopped her was simpler than that, and more dangerous. She wanted him to see her. She wanted the man responsible to ride into what remained of Brindle Hollow and find that it was not entirely empty, that it had not been entirely erased, that one person had refused to become a statistic, a casualty number in some adjutant's report. She wanted to stand in the ashes and make him look, so she stood. When the first riders crested the low rise at the southern road and pulled their horses to a halt at the sight of the destruction, Mara Vale was in the center of the square, both feet planted, hands loose at her sides, watching them the way a woman watches something she has already decided to face. The vanguard soldiers exchanged uncertain looks. One of them, a young man in a lieutenant's sash who was trying very hard to look older than he was, called out across the ruined square. "This village has been cleared by order of the crown. State your name and your business here." "My name is Mara Vale," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "My business is that I live here." "Lived," the lieutenant corrected, with the tone of someone who thought precision was the same thing as cruelty. "Lived," Mara agreed, "until your king made it past tense." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when a room, or in this case a ruined village square, collectively holds its breath. Then the vanguard parted. What? He was taller than she had expected. She wasn't sure why that surprised her. She'd heard descriptions of Alpha King Roderick Vane, the same way everyone in the frontier territories had heard them. In pieces, fragments, rumors traded across tavern tables and whispered in the dark corners of market stalls. The Wolf King, they called him. Youngest ruler in 3 generations, crowned at 22 after his father's sudden death. 6 feet and 4 inches of organized lethality, with the kind of physical presence that made the air in a room behave differently when he entered it. The descriptions were accurate. Roderick Vane rode a black destrier that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains at his back. He wore no crown. She'd heard he rarely did outside a formal court, but his armor was unmistakable, deep charcoal steel with the Vane wolf crest embossed across the breastplate. The animal caught mid-leap, its mouth open, all controlled fury and forward momentum. His dark hair was cut short at the sides and slightly longer on top, pushed back from a face that was all clean, severe angles. The kind of face that looked like it had been designed for command rather than warmth. His eyes, when they found her across the ash-gray square, were the color of amber in firelight. He pulled his horse to a stop. For a long moment he simply looked at her. She was aware, with distant clarity, of what she must look like. Filthy, injured, wrapped in makeshift bandages, standing alone in the wreckage of her home. She must have looked like the sole survivor of a catastrophe, which was exactly what she was. She looked back at him without blinking. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She would have recognized guilt. And what she saw was more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't prepared for, a variable his calculations hadn't accounted for. He dismounted. That surprised her too. The lieutenants and senior officers behind him made small, involuntary sounds of uncertainty, the way they might if a commanding general decided to walk into enemy territory on foot. Roderick ignored all of them. He handed his reins to the nearest soldier without looking, and he walked toward her. He stopped when there were perhaps 10 feet between them. This close, she could see details the distance had blurred. The faint scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear. The way his jaw was set in a line so tight, it suggested he was holding something back behind his teeth. The amber of his eyes was brighter than she'd thought, almost luminous in the gray morning light. She could also see the exact moment it happened. She didn't have a name for it then. She wouldn't understand it fully for some time. But she felt it too. A sudden, disconcerting pull, like the feeling of the world tilting slightly on its axis, the ground shifting in a way that had nothing to do with earthquake and everything to do with the inexplicable, territory-less gravity of recognition. As if some part of her, the part that existed beneath thought and language and choice, had looked at this man and said, "There." Roderick Vane went very still. His eyes, those amber fire-lit eyes, widened by a fraction, just a fraction. But on a face that controlled itself as precisely as his did, that fraction was enormous. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was lower than she'd expected too, and rougher at the edges, like gravel under silk. "I already told your lieutenant," Mara said. "Tell me." She studied him for a beat. "Mara Vale. I was the village record keeper. I kept the population count." She paused, letting that land. "Would you like to know what it was?" The muscle in his jaw moved. "How did you survive?" "Luck," she said. "The bad kind. I was outside the village when your soldiers came, in the thornwood, checking the winter trap lines. I smelled the smoke and ran back." She looked around at the ruins with an expression that she kept deliberately flat, because if she let it become what it wanted to become, she would fall apart, and she had decided that she was not going to fall apart in front of this man. I was fast, but not fast enough to save anyone. Just fast enough to watch. Silence. I'm sorry, Roderick said. The words came out like they surprised him too. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, for a long, careful moment. There was something genuine in the lines of his face, something that hadn't been there in the first instant of his approach. But genuine or not, she had stood in these ashes for 3 days, and genuine was not what she needed. Are you? She asked. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. Then why did you order it? The lieutenant behind him made a sharp, alarmed sound. 2 of the guard captains moved their horses forward instinctively. Roderick raised one hand, a single, compact gesture, and they stopped. That's a bold question, he said. I'm the last person left alive in a village of 412, Mara said. I think I've earned bold. He held her gaze for a long moment. His expression was doing something complicated. The conflict of a man who is accustomed to certainty, encountering the edge of uncertainty, testing the boundary the way a boot tests ice. The order I received indicated this village was harboring rebel forces and refusing crown taxation, he said carefully. That it posed a threat to... We had 43 families, Mara interrupted. The oldest among us was a woman named Helva, who was 81 years old and had been weaving baskets since before your father was born. The youngest was a baby named Fen, born 6 weeks ago. He was 8 pounds, 4 ounces. I know because I wrote it down. Her voice stayed level. Only her hands, curling slowly at her sides, betrayed her. We were not rebels. We were farmers and craftspeople and traders and one very tired record keeper. We paid our taxes every season, on time, in full. I have the records to prove it. Or I did, before someone burned them. Something shifted in Roderick's eyes. Not guilt exactly. He still didn't look guilty, not in the simple way she'd have preferred. He looked instead like a man who had just realized that the ground he was standing on might not be as solid as he'd been told. Who told you the order came from me? He asked. Mara blinked. It was the first thing he'd said that genuinely surprised her. The soldiers wore your crest, your colors. Your banner was planted at the Eastern Road. I know what my soldiers wear, he said quietly. I'm asking who told you the order came from me personally. She stared at him. The question opened something in the back of her mind, a door she hadn't known existed because she'd been so certain of the answer that she'd never thought to question the premise. She'd seen the soldiers. She'd seen the banner. She'd assumed. She stopped, started again. Who else would it come from? Roderick looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then he looked away, across the ruined square, up the ash-gray streets, at the black skeleton of the community hall where she'd kept her records. She watched something move across his face that she couldn't name, something that looked, she thought, like the beginning of a terrible suspicion. That, he said very quietly, is exactly the right question. What? They camped at the edge of Brindle Hollow that night because the king's adjutant, a precise little man named Horst, had managed to organize accommodation at the next village some hours east, but the king didn't go. He stayed. He sent the bulk of his retinue ahead with Horst fluttering anxiously in their wake, kept only his personal guard and one older man who rode a brown horse and carried a satchel full of documents. A man Mara would later learn was Captain Brennan Aldous, his most trusted officer, who had served under Roderick's father before serving under Roderick himself. Mara was not precisely a prisoner. She was not precisely free either. When she'd turned to walk toward the thornwood at the edge of the ruins, heading by old instinct for the supply cache she'd built in a hollow oak 3 years ago, 3 soldiers had materialized between her and the tree line with the practiced apologetic efficiency of men who were very good at blocking exits without appearing to do so. The king requests your presence, one of them said, in the tone that made clear the word requests was doing a great deal of diplomatic lifting. She could have fought. The thought crossed her mind with the flat, practical calculation of someone who had grown up on the frontier, where survival sometimes required the willingness to act before thinking. She was quick, and she was strong, and she was furious. But she was also one woman against 15 soldiers, and she was not yet ready to die. She had things to say first, so she went. Roderick had set up a command tent on the flat ground just north of the square. Inside it, a folding table covered in maps and documents, two oil lanterns casting warm light against the canvas walls, and a camp stool that he was not sitting on. He was standing at the table with Brennan Aldis, both of them bent over a document that Brennan was holding flat with both hands. They looked up when she entered. "Sit," Roderick said, gesturing at the stool. Mara stood. He looked at her steadily. "Please sit." "I'll stand," she said, "if it's all the same to you." It clearly was not all the same to him, but he absorbed this with the practiced patience of a man who had learned, probably the hard way, that some battles were not worth fighting. "You said you kept records," he said, "population counts, tax records." "Yes, and you said they were burned. Most of them, the physical copies." She paused, choosing her words with care. "But I remember everything I wrote. Every entry, every season, every number. I've been keeping those records since I was 17 years old. 8 years of data, all of it in my head." Brennan Aldis looked up from the document with the expression of a man whose interest has just been genuinely captured. He had a broad, weathered face and gray-streaked hair cut close, and eyes that moved with the quick, measuring intelligence of someone who had spent decades separating useful information from noise. "Everything," he said. "Everything," Mara said. "Can you account for the grain distribution in the last 3 seasons?" Roderick asked. His voice had changed slightly, the careful, controlled quality of a man in interrogation mode, asking questions the way a surgeon makes incisions. "We harvested 4,200 bushels last autumn," Mara said without hesitation. "Of that, the Crown's portion was 1/5, which is 840 bushels. It was transported on the 12th day of the harvest month by a grain convoy under the supervision of an officer named—" She searched her memory for a second, then found it. "Named Sub-Marshal Dennick Grail. He gave our headman a receipt stamp. I recorded it the same day." Silence in the tent. Brennan Aldis set down the document he was holding and picked up a different one. He ran his finger down a column of figures, then stopped. He looked at Roderick. Something passed between them in that look, quick and heavy and wordless. "What?" Mara said. "The Crown's grain records," Roderick said slowly, "show Brindle Hollow's last documented payment as 2 seasons ago, and significantly less than the amount you're describing." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Mara said, very carefully, "That's not possible." "No," Roderick agreed. "It isn't." They talked until the lanterns burned low. Mara talked, and Brennan Aldis wrote, and Roderick listened with the focused, unnerving attention of a man who understood that information was the most dangerous weapon in any room. She gave them everything she had: names, numbers, dates, the specific sequence of transactions and deliveries and receipts that made up 8 years of Brindle Hollow's financial relationship with the Crown. She cited amounts down to the quarter bushel. She named officers and named dates and named the exact figures that had been recorded in the leather-bound ledger under the hearthstone that someone had apparently needed to destroy badly enough to burn an entire village. As she talked, she watched Roderick's expression change. The controlled, careful blankness that seemed to be his default public face was eroding, slowly, the way frost melts off stone, the stone itself unchanged beneath, but the surface becoming something rawer and more exposed. By the second hour, he had stopped pretending to reference documents and was simply looking at her, arms crossed, that amber gaze fixed on her face with an intensity she'd only ever seen in people confronting something they urgently needed to understand. "The grain sub-marshal," Brennan said at one point, flipping back through his notes. "Dennick Grail. Do you know who he reported to?" "He mentioned Lord Garrick once," Mara said. "When I asked about the transit routes, I was trying to understand why the convoys always went east through Keld Pass rather than north through the Brindle Road, which is faster. He said the routing was Lord Garrick's preference." Another look between Brennan and Roderick. "Lord Garrick is the king's uncle," Brennan said, not to Mara but to his notes, with the deliberate, careful tone of a man choosing to state a fact out loud, because saying it makes it more real than thinking it. "I know who Lord Garrick is," Mara said. "Do you know what his role in the Crown administration?" "He oversees the eastern frontier territories," Mara said. trade regulation, taxation, and grain management in everything west of the Keld Range, which includes Brindle Hollow. She paused. Which included. The correction landed in the tent like a stone in still water. Roderick uncrossed his arms. He walked to the tent opening and stood there for a moment with his back to them, looking out at the dark ruins beyond. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid, controlled tension of a man who was very good at anger but was choosing, right now, to be something else instead. "Who brought you the order to clear Brindle Hollow?" Mara asked. She directed it at his back. He turned to face her. It arrived through standard administrative channels, a signed directive from the Frontier Oversight Office. Signed by Lord Garrick. He didn't answer. Which was, she supposed, its own kind of answer. An order that accused us of harboring rebels, Mara continued, and refusing taxation. Except we weren't, and we hadn't. She looked at him with all the exhausted, burned-down intensity of 3 days of ash and grief. "Someone lied to you, Your Majesty. Someone used your name, your soldiers, your crown to eliminate a village that had done nothing wrong. And I think the reason they burned our records is the same reason they invented the charge of tax evasion, because our records proved we were paying. And if we were paying, then the question becomes, where did the money go?" Silence. Brennan Aldous had stopped writing. He was looking at Mara with something that had moved well past professional interest into something closer to awe. Roderick looked at her for a long time without speaking. The amber of his eyes in the lamplight was very still, the stillness of deep water rather than still air, something moving beneath the surface. "You said you were a record keeper," he said finally. "I was," Mara said. "I was a lot of things. What are you now?" She thought about it. She thought about the ash under her feet. She thought about the baby named Fen, 8 pounds 4 ounces, who would never learn to walk. She thought about old Helva and her baskets, and the Aldrich family's handprints in the doorframe, and the dark thing in the well. She thought about 8 years of ledger entries she could recite from memory, and the way a grain convoy's routing could tell you everything about who was stealing from whom. "Now," she said, "now I'm a witness." He took her to the Capitol. He framed it as protective custody, an investigation into the destruction of Brindle Hollow, pending a review of frontier administrative orders. The framing was careful and lawyerly and technically true. But Mara was clear-eyed enough to understand what it also was. She was the only witness to an inconvenient truth, which made her either an asset or a liability, and the king hadn't yet decided which. She went because she had nowhere else to go, and because the answers she needed were there. The journey took 4 days. They traveled with the king's personal guard, 12 soldiers, Brennan Aldous, and the perpetually anxious Horst, who seemed to view Mara as an administrative problem that hadn't yet been properly categorized. She rode a brown mare from the village's surviving stable, the only horse that hadn't been claimed by soldiers or frightened into the thornwood. She named the mare Ember. On the first morning, riding a half-length behind Roderick as the eastern road curved through the golden-brown grasslands of the frontier, Mara found herself watching him the way she'd learned to watch things she needed to understand, steadily, without appearing to stare, absorbing detail. He rode well. Not just technically, though he was clearly technically excellent, the kind of rider whose body has been doing this long enough that the horse and the rider move as a single organism. He rode attentively. She noticed that he watched the horizon in a regular sweep, left, center, right, and that his right hand was never more than an inch from the long knife at his hip. Not paranoia, discipline. The habit of a man who understood that the world contains threats and has chosen to be aware of them rather than surprised by them. She also noticed, though she filed this information away without yet knowing what to do with it, that he looked back at her. Not constantly, not obviously, but with a regularity that suggested something other than prisoner management. On the second evening, they made camp by a river, and Brennan Aldous found a reason to sit near her while the soldiers built fires. "He's not what people say he is," the older man said, without preamble or introduction, staring at the river with the philosophical air of someone who has been carrying a thought for a while and has decided now is the time to set it down. Mara, who was eating hard bread and trying to convince her hands to stop shaking long enough to hold it, looked at him sideways. "What do people say he is?" "Cold, Ruthless, his father's stone-faced son. Brennan paused. He's not. He's careful. There's a difference. Cold doesn't care what happens. Careful minds very much. It just doesn't show it where enemies can see. Mara was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Brennan looked at her with his quick, measuring eyes. Because he brought you with us instead of leaving you in the ruins, he said simply. And because in 30 years of service to this crown, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you in that square. Mara had no answer for that. Later, lying awake in the small tent they'd given her, listening to the river and the fire and the distant murmur of the night watch, she turned Brennan's words over the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath it. She thought about the way the world had tilted. She thought about that moment of inexplicable, unwanted recognition. The pull she'd felt when Roderick walked toward her across the ash-gray square. The there that had resonated in some part of her that had nothing to do with logic. She thought about this fact that she was riding toward the capital city of the man who had destroyed her home, and that somewhere beneath the grief and the fury and the carefully banked fire of her need for justice, there was something else entirely. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that frightened her more than the soldiers. She closed her eyes. Outside, the river moved over its stones with the patient, relentless sound of water that has decided where it's going and will not be redirected. Vane's hold rose out of the morning mist on the fourth day like something that had decided to become a mountain and then changed its mind halfway through. It was built on the natural elevation of a granite ridge. The original fortress expanded over centuries into a complex of towers and walls and lower courtyards that spread down the hillside in tiers, each level connected to the next by broad stone staircases wide enough to march armies up. The city of Keldrath had grown around the base of the ridge like a settlement that had decided to shelter in the shadow of something enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people living in streets that had been built and rebuilt so many times their original geometry was long gone, replaced by the organic tangle of a city that had grown the way living things grow, outward in every direction with no plan but survival. Mara had seen illustrations of it in the books the village schoolteacher had kept. The illustrations had done it no justice whatsoever. She rode in through the eastern gate behind the king's vanguard and spent the first minutes doing nothing but looking. The size of it, the noise of it, the layered, complex noise of 100,000 lives happening simultaneously, the shouts and the wheels and the bells, and somewhere, inexplicably, someone playing a stringed instrument with more enthusiasm than skill. The smell of it, bread and smoke and river mud and horse, and the distant salt-tinged hint of the coastal wind coming in from the west. She caught herself thinking that she wished she could bring Helva here. The old woman had never left the frontier in her life, and had always been quietly, fiercely curious about the world beyond it. The grief hit her so hard and so suddenly that she nearly lost her seat on the mare. She steadied herself, straightened her spine, fixed her eyes ahead. Ember, perhaps sensing something, walked a step closer to the large black destrier in front of her. Roderick glanced back. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that she filed carefully in the same mental drawer as Brennan's words by the river. They rode on. They rode into the hold and into the beginning of something that would undo an empire's lies. One careful, furious, documented truth at a time. They gave her rooms in the south wing of the hold, not a cell, not a servant's quarters, but actual rooms. A sitting room with good light, a bedroom with a proper bed and 2 wool blankets, a narrow window that looked out over the lower city and the glint of the river beyond it. There was a tray of food waiting on the table. Bread, cheese, a bowl of winter fruit, a carafe of water. She stood in the middle of the sitting room for a long time after the soldier who'd escorted her there closed the door. She thought about the community hall, the hearthstone, the leather-bound ledger. Then she sat down at the table and began to eat, because she was alive and she intended to stay that way, and she could not do what needed to be done on an empty stomach. 3 hours later, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find not a soldier, and not Brennan Aldous, but a young woman approximately her own age with ink-stained fingers, a pile of documents under one arm, and the slightly distracted air of someone who has been running since before breakfast. "You're Mara Vale," the woman said, less as a greeting and more as a confirmation she was checking off a list. "I am," Mara said. "I'm Lyra Thane, Royal Archivist, Secondary Division, Frontier Records." She hefted the documents under her arm. "Captain Aldous says you have 8 years of Frontier grain data memorized." "I do." Lyra Thane looked at her with the expression of someone being offered exactly what they need at exactly the right time. "I've been trying to reconcile the Frontier accounts for 14 months, she said. "There are gaps in the records that I haven't been able to explain, and that 2 senior archivists told me were normal administrative variants." She paused. "They're not normal administrative variants, are they?" Mara looked at this woman, the ink-stained fingers, the tired eyes, the 14 months of careful, stubborn, unacknowledged work, and felt something shift inside her, not the tectonic shift of grief or the bone-deep shift of that inexplicable recognition in the square. Something smaller and more specific, the particular feeling of finding an ally. "No," Mara said, "they're not." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "We have a lot of work to do." Outside her window, Vane's hold settled into its evening routines. Lights appeared in the lower city windows like scattered embers, one by one, and then by dozens, until the hillside was starred with them. The river caught the last of the sunset and held it for a moment, copper and amber and the deep, burning orange of a world on fire. In the south wing sitting room, 2 women sat across a table covered in documents and began carefully and methodically to rebuild the truth from memory. And in his private study 3 floors above, Alpha King Roderick Vane stood at his window and looked out at the same sunset and pressed one hand flat against the glass as if touching something he wasn't yet sure he was allowed to want. The bond sang in him like a plucked string, resonant and clear and impossible to ignore. He had destroyed her world without meaning to. Now something in him, something old and certain and not quite human, was insisting that the only acceptable answer was to build her a better one. He didn't know yet how to do that. But he was the Alpha King, and he had never in his life encountered a problem he was willing to stop before solving. He turned from the window. He had work to do. The work began before dawn. Mara had not slept. She wasn't sure she remembered how to sleep, not the real kind, the deep, restoring kind that leaves a person feeling rebuilt rather than merely rested. Every time she closed her eyes in the unfamiliar softness of the south wing bedroom, she found herself back in the ash, back in the square, back counting handprints. So she worked instead. Lyra Thane, it turned out, also did not sleep when there was a problem demanding her attention. She had reappeared at Mara's door at the 5th hour of the morning with a second stack of documents under her arm, 2 cups of something hot and bitter that she called working tea, and the focused, slightly feverish energy of someone who had spent the night running numbers in her head. "I cross-referenced the routing records for the Eastern grain convoys against the transit stamps from the Keld Pass checkpoint," Lyra said, spreading documents across the sitting room table with practiced efficiency, anchoring the corners with cups and a small iron inkwell. "The stamps record the date, the officer in charge, and the cargo quantity. If I compare those numbers against the village payment receipts, the numbers won't match," Mara said. Lyra looked up. "You're sure?" "The convoy that collected our harvest payment 3 seasons ago was recorded in our ledger as carrying 840 bushels. That was the correct 1/5 tithe on our total harvest." Mara pulled the nearest document toward her, a transit log from the Keld Pass station, columns of figures in a clerk's cramped hand. "What does the stamp say for the 12th day of the harvest month 3 seasons back?" Lyra found the entry quickly, running her finger down the column with the ease of someone who has been reading ledgers since childhood. She stopped. She read the entry. She read it again. 412 bushels, she said quietly. The number hung in the air between them. "Half," Mara said. "Exactly half, which means someone collected 840 bushels from Brindle Hollow, transported 412 to the Crown's granaries, and the remaining 428 bushels went somewhere else," Lyra finished. She sat back in her chair and looked at Mara with eyes that had gone from the slightly distracted alertness of a researcher to something sharper and more frightened. "This isn't just Brindle Hollow, is it?" It wasn't a question. Mara answered it anyway. "Pull the records for every village in the Western Frontier Territories," she said. Everyone that falls under Eastern administrative oversight. I'd start with the last 5 seasons and work backward. She picked up her cup of working tea. I'll tell you what the villages actually paid. You tell me what the transit stamps say, and we'll see how large a hole someone has cut in this kingdom's grain supply. Lyra was already moving. By mid-morning, they had confirmed 6 villages. By midday, it was 11. By the time the light through Mara's narrow window had shifted from the cool gray gold of morning to the harder, flatter light of afternoon, they had documented 17 frontier settlements where the transit records showed systematic discrepancies. Always exactly, always cleanly, in the range of 40 to 60% of the actual tithe collected. It was too consistent to be accident. Accidents were messy. They clustered in some years and vanished in others. They varied in size and pattern, and the specific way the numbers failed to add up. What Mara and Lyra were looking at was the opposite of messy. It was precise, it was regular, and it had been running, as best they could determine, for at least 7 years. 7 years, Lyra said. She was pacing now, moving back and forth between the window and the table with the restless energy of someone whose mind was running faster than her feet. That predates Roderick's rule. His father was still king 7 years ago. Which means it wasn't enabled by Roderick, Mara said carefully. But it continued after he took the throne. Which means either he knew and allowed it, or he didn't know, Lyra said. Because the people responsible for reporting it to him are the same people running it. Silence. Lord Garrick, Mara said. Lord Garrick has been the head of Eastern Frontier Administration for 12 years. Lyra stopped pacing. She had gone slightly pale, the color of someone who has just understood the full dimension of something that had previously seemed merely large. The transit routing, the checkpoint officers, the grain submarshals, they all report to him. If he controls the information that reaches the king, then the king only knows what Garrick wants him to know. Mara set down her cup. Including which villages are rebels. Including which villages need to be cleared. The word cleared fell out of her mouth like a stone. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Lyra said very quietly, "We need to tell Roderick." "We need more than 17 villages," Mara said. "We need the origin point, the account that receives the diverted grain, the sale records, the buyers, whoever has been converting stolen food into private wealth for 7 years. Numbers are compelling, but numbers alone can be denied, re-explained, attributed to clerical error." She looked at the documents spread across the table. "We need the money." "How?" Mara thought about it. She thought about the routing, the specific, deliberate choice to run convoys through Keld Pass rather than the faster northern route. She thought about what was east of Keld Pass. What kind of market existed in those territories for large, regular quantities of grain arriving without official crown provenance? "The pass merchants," she said. "Keld Pass has a trading post at its eastern mouth. Independent traders, not crown licensed. If someone was reselling diverted grain, they'd need a buyer who wouldn't ask questions about documentation." She stood up. "I need access to the trading post ledgers." Lyra stared at her. "Those are private commercial records. I don't have authority to requisition." "Who does?" "A beat." "Brennan Aldous," Lyra said slowly. "He has frontier intelligence authority. Under the Crown Charter, he can compel disclosure of commercial records if there's evidence of Crown fraud." "Then we need Brennan Aldous." "We need to go through proper channels," Lyra said, but she said it the way a person says something they already know is wrong, out of habit rather than conviction. Mara looked at her steadily. "Lyra, 17 villages, 7 years, 412 people in Brindle Hollow who followed every proper channel and ended up as ash." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'm done with proper channels." Lyra held her gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her ink-stained satchel, tucked the most critical documents inside it, and headed for the door. "Brennan Aldous keeps his office on the 3rd floor of the North Tower," she said. "He usually eats lunch at his desk. If we go now, we can catch him before his afternoon briefings." Mara followed her. The corridors of Vane's hold were not what she'd expected. She'd had some vague image, assembled from books and rumors and the general mythology of royal power, of something cold and intimidating. Stone passages lined with weapons and portraits, designed to make visitors feel small. What she found instead was something that had clearly been built for function and had accumulated its grandeur somewhat accidentally over the centuries. The stone was old and warm-colored, worn smooth in the centers of staircase steps by generations of feet. There were tapestries on the walls, but they showed battles and harvests and maps rather than royal portraits, and several of them had been mended in places, the patches nearly invisible unless you looked for them. She noticed a group of household staff in the corridor who stepped aside for Lyra without acknowledgement, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was that two of them glanced at her. Mara, in her frontier clothing, her singed hair barely combed, her bandaged hands, with the careful, neutral expression of people who know something is happening but aren't sure what it means yet. She filed that observation away. The North Tower staircase was narrow and lit by windows on the south face, and the door at the top was open, which Lyra seemed to take as a good sign. She walked in without knocking. Brennan Aldous was, as predicted, eating lunch at his desk. He looked up from a bowl of something steaming and a document he was holding at arm's length in the particular way of a man who needs reading glasses but refuses to admit it. "Miss Thane," he said. His eyes moved to Mara. "Miss Vale." A pause, during which he registered the satchel of documents and their combined expression, which Mara imagined was the particular face of two people who have found something they urgently need someone else to act on. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me." They told him. It took 20 minutes, interrupted twice by Brennan asking pointed, specific questions about the documentation. Not skeptical questions, Mara noted, but verification questions, the kind asked by someone who already suspects the answer and is building the evidentiary foundation to act on it. By the time Lyra placed the transit logs from Keld Pass side by side with Mara's memorized payment figures, his lunch had gone cold and untouched. "The trading post ledgers," he said at the end. Not a question. "We need them," Mara confirmed. Brennan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at Mara. She held his gaze and let him read whatever he needed to read in her face, the exhaustion, the grief, the hard, banked determination that had replaced it. "This goes to Lord Garrick's territory," he said. "Yes. If he suspects we're building a case, then he'll move to destroy evidence," Mara said, "which means we need the trading post records before he knows we're looking." She paused. "How quickly can you requisition them?" Brennan looked at the documents one more time. Then he stood up, set his lunch bowl on the windowsill, and reached for his coat. "I can have a courier at Keld Pass by tomorrow morning," he said, "if I write the order in the next 10 minutes. He looked at both of them. "Neither of you is to mention Lord Garrick's name in connection with this until I have the king in the room and the documents in hand. Not to anyone. Not to household staff. Not to other archivists. Not to guards. Am I clear?" "Perfectly," Lyra said. "Miss Vale." He looked at her directly. "You in particular. I know what you lost. I know what you want. But if Lord Garrick gets even a whisper of this before we're ready, the documents disappear, the witnesses disappear, and you become a hysterical frontier survivor making unfounded accusations against a senior member of the royal family." His voice wasn't unkind, but it was absolutely uncompromising. "Can you give me 3 days?" Mara thought about Ash. She thought about proper channels. She thought about what 3 days of patience might buy 412 names that deserved more than being dismissed as rebel casualties. 3 days, she said. The 3 days were not quiet. The hold was a political organism, complex and self-aware, with the particular sensitivity of a body that has learned to detect foreign elements. Within 24 hours of her arrival, Mara was conscious of being watched, not by soldiers, but by the subtler machinery of court attention. She noticed it in the way conversations in corridors stopped as she passed, then resumed in lower registers. In the way a senior household steward who crossed her path in the south wing gave her a long, assessing look before stepping aside. In the way 2 noble women she passed on the main staircase exchanged a glance over her head that managed to convey volumes without a single audible word. She was, she understood, an anomaly. A frontier woman in travel-stained clothes who had arrived in the king's retinue under circumstances that no one had officially explained, housed in south wing rooms that were not quite prisoner and not quite guest. The court didn't know what to make of her, and it expressed this uncertainty the way courts always have throughout history, through conjecture, hierarchy, enforcement, and the carefully weaponized social pressure of making someone feel at every possible moment that they do not belong. The second day, she was invited to a midday meal with the senior ladies of the household. She understood immediately that invited was not the right word. The message had been delivered by a steward with the particular manner of someone conveying a requirement dressed as a courtesy. She went because refusing would have drawn attention she didn't need, and because Brennan's warning about Garrick was still very present in her mind. The dining room was smaller than the main hall, but no less formal. Polished stone floors, a long table set with more silverware than seemed reasonable for a meal, women in the kind of layered, expensive clothing that required help to put on and generated its own ambient sound of rustling whenever anyone moved. Mara sat at the end of the table in her frontier clothes and felt, with flat clarity, that this was intentional. The woman at the head of the table was Lady Vera Colton, the head stewardess of the hold, a woman of perhaps 50 with silver hair swept back in severe elegance, and eyes the particular shade of pale blue that managed to look both beautiful and cold at the same time. She smiled at Mara with the warmth of a winter window. "Miss Vale," she said, "we're so glad you could join us. We've heard so very much about you." "I'm sure you have," Mara said pleasantly. A small, well-calibrated silence. A few glances exchanged around the table, quick and practiced, like the communication system of people who have been speaking this language for so long it requires no conscious effort. "You've come from the western frontier," Lady Vera continued. "Brindle Hollow, was it?" "It was." "A tragic business," said a younger woman to Vera's right. Lady something. Mara hadn't caught the name. She had the carefully assembled expression of sympathy that actually conveys nothing of the kind. Rebel villages do put the crown in such impossible positions. Brindle Hollow was not a rebel village, Mara said. She said it the same way she'd said everything difficult since arriving at the hold, quietly, without heat, in the tone of someone stating a fact that does not require emotional decoration to be true. Another silence. This one had a slightly different texture. "The official directive," Lady Vera began. "The official directive was based on falsified information," Mara said, "which is currently being investigated. I'm sure you'll hear more about that through appropriate channels." The phrase appropriate channels landed with the particular precision she'd intended, a reminder that she had allies in this building, that she was not a stray pulled in off the road, that whatever Vera and her companions thought they were looking at something more complicated. Vera studied her for a moment. The pale blue eyes moved over Mara's face with the thoroughness of a woman who has spent decades reading people. "You're very calm," she said finally, "for someone in your position." "What position is that?" Mara asked. "Entirely dependent on the king's continued interest," Vera said, "which, in my experience, is not a reliable foundation on which to build one's future." Mara looked at her. She thought about what Brennan had said by the river. Careful minds, very much. It just doesn't show it where enemies can see. She thought about this fact that this woman had been managing this household, this court, this network of observation and influence for longer than Mara had been an adult. She thought about the baby named Fen. "Thank you for the advice," she said. "I'll keep it in mind." She ate her lunch, answered exactly as many questions as she chose to answer, and left when the meal was over. She did not hurry. She did not look back. In the corridor outside, alone, she let out a slow breath that she'd been holding for most of an hour, and kept walking. The king found her on the evening of the second day. She was in the library, a room Lyra had shown her on the first afternoon, a long, high-ceiling space on the second floor of the West Wing, filled with the kind of organized, beloved disorder of books that have been actually read rather than displayed. She'd been working through the administrative charter records, looking for the specific statutory language that defined the limits of frontier oversight authority, the legal architecture of Garrick's power, which she wanted to understand completely before the confrontation that was coming. She heard footsteps on the stone floor behind her and recognized them before she looked up. She'd learned, without quite meaning to, the specific sound of Roderick Vane moving through a building. He moved quietly for a large man, but not silently. There was a deliberateness to his footsteps, a measured quality, that was different from the efficient near silence of trained soldiers, and different again from the casual sound of household staff. He moved like someone who always knew exactly where he was going, but was not rushing to get there. She kept her eyes on the document in front of her until he was close enough that looking up was unavoidable. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been working," she said. "Is there a difference?" She looked up at him. He was in simpler clothes than she'd seen him in before. A dark shirt, no armor, the kind of clothing that suggested the end of an official day rather than the performance of one. He looked, in this light, slightly less like the Wolf King of myth, and slightly more like a man who was tired and trying not to show it. He sat down in the chair across the reading table from her, with the unhurried confidence of someone who owns the chair, the table, the library, and the building around all of them, but is choosing not to make a point of it. "How is the investigation?" he asked. "Brennan is handling it." "I know what Brennan is handling. I'm asking how you are finding it." She considered him. "You could just ask Brennan." "Brennan gives me information," Roderick said. "I'm asking you for something else." She set down the charter document. "What?" "Your read of it." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, and she was again struck by the quality of his attention, the way he listened like someone who understands that the information he needs is often in the negative spaces of what's being said rather than the words themselves. "You've been in that room with Lyra for 2 days. You know more about the pattern of what was done to your village, and apparently a great many others, than anyone in this building. I want to know what you think is actually happening." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about proper channels. She thought about Brennan's 3 days. Then she thought, he's the king. This is his kingdom. And he is sitting in front of her asking her to tell him the truth. "Someone has been running a secondary taxation system on the western frontier for at least 7 years, she said. "Not a shadow system. An inversion of the official one. The official system collects grain from villages and transports it to crown granaries. The secondary system collects grain from villages and diverts a portion of it, through controlled routing, to private buyers at the eastern trading posts. The official records are altered to show lower collection numbers, which means the crown's granaries show deficits, which means the crown believes the frontier villages are underperforming, not paying their full tithe." She paused. "Villages that pushed back, that kept their own records carefully enough to contest the official numbers, that had record keepers persistent enough to notice the discrepancy and document it. Those villages became inconvenient. And inconvenient villages, under the Frontier Administration Charter, can be designated as non-compliant, which gives the oversight authority power to clear them," Roderick said. His voice had gone very flat. "Yes." The silence was long. "How many villages?" he asked. "At minimum, 17. Possibly more. Brennan is waiting on records from the Eastern Trading Post that may clarify the full scope." 7 years. He said it the way Lyra had said it. Not disbelief, but the specific kind of stunned acknowledgement that comes from confronting a thing you couldn't have imagined because you trust the people who would have told you about it. 7 years and no one— "Who would have told you?" Mara asked. Not cruelly, genuinely. "The information flows through your frontier administration. The reports come from the oversight office. If the person running the oversight office controls what reaches you, then I only know what he wants me to know." He stood up abruptly, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her in almost exactly the same posture she'd seen in the command tent 3 nights ago. That rigid, controlled tension, the anger being held in deliberate suspension rather than released. "Lord Garrick," he said to the window. She didn't answer. She let him sit with it. He turned around after a moment. The amber of his eyes was very bright in the library's lamplight, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, though the anger was clearly there. Something more personal. The expression of betrayal, which is always deeper than ordinary anger because it requires having trusted first. "He was my father's brother," Roderick said. "He was regent for 2 years after my father died while I was—" He stopped. "He was one of the people I trusted most in this court." "I know," Mara said quietly. "How?" "Because you didn't know. If you hadn't trusted him, you would have watched him, and if you'd watched him, This couldn't have run 7 years. He looked at her. She held his gaze. She didn't soften it, and she didn't apologize for it. The truth was the truth, and he'd asked for it, and she'd found that watering down the truth to protect the feelings of powerful people was one of the mechanisms that had helped this particular lie run for 7 years. "The Trading Post records," he said. "When do we have them?" "Tomorrow, if Brennan's courier made the pass by dawn." "And then?" "And then we put it in front of you officially," Mara said. "You, Brennan, Lyra, and the documents. Everything documented, everything sourced, no reliance on memory alone." She paused. "And then it's your decision what to do with it." Roderick was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that measuring, focused attention. "It must be strange," he said, "sitting in my library, helping me understand the crimes committed in my name, when you're the one whose soldiers I watched burn my village down," Mara said. She said it without flinching. "Yes, it's strange. Why are you doing it?" The question surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, it was the most reasonable question in the room, but because she hadn't expected him to ask it. She'd half expected him to assume she had no choice, that her cooperation was a function of her captivity rather than her agency. The fact that he was asking, that he understood there was a difference, that her presence here was a choice she was making, and a fragile one at that, said something about him that she didn't quite know what to do with. She looked down at the administrative charter document on the table. "Because the truth about what happened to Brindle Hollow doesn't do my people any good buried in Trading Post ledgers," she said. "Because the only way what was done to them means anything is if it changes something, if someone is held accountable, if the thing that killed them gets fixed rather than simply hidden." She looked back up at him. "And because you're the only person in this building with the authority to do that." A long pause. "You're trusting me with it," he said. "After everything." "I'm investing in the most effective available instrument," she said. "Don't mistake it for trust." Something moved in his expression. Not offense, she thought, but the kind of response a person has when something hits them in exactly the right place. A slight shifting, like a door opening a crack. "Fair enough," he said quietly. He left the library. She sat for a long moment in the lamplight, her hand flat on the charter document, listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Then she picked up the document and kept reading. The Trading Post records arrived on the third morning, delivered by a dusty, exhausted courier who handed them directly to Brennan Aldous and was immediately sent to the kitchens to be fed. Brennan brought them to Mara and Lyra's working room at the 7th hour, set them on the table, and stood back with the expression of a man who has just placed an explosive device in the center of a room and wants everyone present to understand what they're looking at. "It's all there," he said. "Buyer names, purchase dates, quantities. There's a standing account under a commercial alias, Eastgate Provisions, that has been purchasing grain from a Keld Pass trader named Fen Morick every season for 6 years. Consistent quantities. Consistent pricing. No documentation of provenance." "Eastgate Provisions," Lyra said, pulling the ledger toward her. "Does the alias have a registered holder?" "It does." Brennan paused. "It's registered to a property management company in the eastern city of Vial. That company is wholly owned by a private land trust." Another pause. "The trustee of that land trust is a man named Darren Kolst." Mara looked up. "Should I know that name?" "You wouldn't. He's a minor legal figure in the Eastern Territories." Brennan's voice was measured and deliberate. "He is also under a different surname, his mother's, which he took after a legal dispute 30 years ago. The personal secretary of Lord Garrick Vane." The silence in the room was absolute. Lyra set down the ledger. She looked at Brennan. She looked at Mara. "That's it," she said softly. "That's the connection." "That's the connection," Brennan agreed. Mara looked at the documents on the table. 17 villages, 7 years, the patient, meticulous architecture of a theft so large it had required burning people alive to protect it. She looked at the name written in a clerk's commercial handwriting, the alias that connected a lord's personal secretary to a grain reselling operation built on the bones of frontier communities. "We need the king," she said. I've already sent word, Brennan said. He'll meet us in the map room in 1 hour. The map room was at the center of the hold, a round chamber on the 3rd floor with windows on all sides, and a large central table on which a relief map of the entire kingdom was laid out in painted stone and copper wire. The frontier territories marked in the pale brown of open land, the mountains of the Keld Range rising in miniature along the eastern edge. Roderick was already there when they arrived. He was not alone. She hadn't expected Lord Garrick. He was standing at the far side of the map table when Mara entered behind Brennan and Lyra, a man of perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders with the still powerful build of someone who had been a formidable physical presence in younger years and hadn't entirely lost it. His hair was silver and carefully kept, his clothing the quiet, precise quality of someone who understood that true power doesn't need to announce itself through decoration. He had Roderick's amber eyes, she noticed. The same coloring, diluted across a generation, more gold than amber, but recognizably family. He was looking at her, not with surprise, with the measuring, calibrating attention of a man who has been told something is coming and has prepared a response. Mara felt the air change in the room. Beside her, she felt Brennan go very still. Lord Garrick, Roderick said, his voice carefully level, expressed his wish to be present for any investigation briefing related to frontier administrative matters, as it falls within his oversight. He looked at Mara as he said it, and in that look was a message she read clearly. I did not invite him. He invited himself. And I did not yet have grounds to exclude him. Garrick smiled at Mara. It was an excellent smile, warm, avuncular, the smile of a man practiced at being the most comfortable presence in any room. Miss Vale, he said, I've heard a great deal about you. The survivor of Brindle Hollow, a remarkable young woman by all accounts. He gestured at the documents under Brennan's arm. I understand you've been assisting the archival review of the frontier accounts. A noble effort. I hope the records have been illuminating. Very, Mara said. Good. He clasped his hands behind his back. I've actually been meaning to review the Western accounts myself. There have been some irregularities I've been intending to address. Clerical errors, mostly, the kind that accumulate when oversight is spread across such a wide territory. I'm glad the review has begun. A practiced pause. Of course, records from trading posts and private commercial ledgers have limited evidentiary value without proper chain of custody documentation and independent audit verification. Anything less would be, legally speaking, insufficient basis for formal accusation against any party. He said it pleasantly, almost helpfully, in the tone of a man explaining the rules of a game to someone who doesn't yet understand they're already losing. Mara looked at him. She looked at Roderick, who was watching Lord Garrick with the still, amber gaze of a man who had just heard something confirm his worst suspicion and was deciding what to do with it. She looked back at Garrick. She thought about Brennan's warning. 3 days of careful, patient evidence building, the fragility of chain of custody, the legal thicket that surrounded any accusation against a senior member of the royal family. She thought about the baby named Fen. She thought, he already knows we have the documents. He came here to make them inadmissible before we can present them. And the only way to stop that. The documents have full chain of custody, she said. The Keld Pass transit stamps are official Crown records and have been in continuous archival custody since their creation. The commercial ledgers were requisitioned under Captain Aldis's Frontier Intelligence Authority, witnessed and sealed by 2 hold archivists before transport. She paused, just for a beat. As for the Eastgate Provisions account registered to a land trust held by your personal secretary under his maternal surname, I imagine the audit verification on that will be very thorough. Lord Garrick's smile did not disappear, but it changed. It became something slightly different. Still warm, still careful, but with an edge underneath it now, the smile of a man who has just recalculated. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's a serious document, Mara said. The room was very quiet. Roderick looked at Garrick for a long moment. Then he looked at Brennan. Are the documents as she describes? Yes, Brennan said. Chain of custody is complete and documented. Another silence, the kind that has weight and direction. Then we'll proceed, Roderick said. He said it quietly, without drama. But Mara watched Garrick's expression as Roderick said it. watched the precise moment when the older man understood that the board had shifted, that the performance of cooperative innocence was no longer sufficient, that whatever moves he'd planned to make in this room had just become inadequate. And in Garrick's eyes, beneath the careful surface of a man who had been playing this particular game for 30 years, she saw something cold and decided appear. Not defeat. Not yet. Something that looked, she thought, very much like the face of a man switching from a defensive strategy to an offensive one. She kept her own expression level. She had 3 days of documentation and 2 allies she trusted. He had 30 years of institutional power, a network of officials who owed him their positions, and the kind of deep-rooted influence that didn't disappear simply because a king had been shown evidence. The confrontation in the map room was not the end of anything. She understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had survived 3 days in the ashes of her home, that it was precisely the beginning. The map room cleared slowly, the way rooms clear after something irreversible has been said, people moving with the careful, deliberate energy of those who understand that whatever happens next will be decided in the hours immediately following this one. Lord Garrick was the last to leave. He walked out unhurried, hands still clasped behind his back, offering Roderick a deferential half-bow at the door that managed to convey absolute submission while communicating, to anyone trained enough to read it, the precise opposite. Mara watched him go. She watched the set of his shoulders and the unhurried quality of his steps, and she thought about the cold, switching thing she'd seen in his eyes at the moment Roderick said, "We'll proceed." She thought, a man who has been running a 7-year theft through an empire's administrative infrastructure doesn't panic when he's caught. He adapts. She thought, he already has a next move. He walked into this room knowing he might lose it, and he walked out knowing what he was going to do instead. She caught Brennan's eye across the map table. He gave her the smallest possible nod, which she read as, "I know. I saw it too." Roderick was looking at the relief map, the painted stone of the frontier territories, the miniature copper wire mountains of the Keld Range. He had one hand flat on the table beside it, a posture she'd come to recognize as the physical expression of a mind working at speed, the body needing an anchor point while the thinking ran ahead of it. "He'll move tonight," Roderick said. Not a question. "Yes, Brennan said. "The secretary, Darren Kolst. He'll be gone by morning if we don't bring him in now." Brennan picked up the Keld Pass ledgers and tucked them under his arm with the decisive efficiency of a man shifting to operational mode. "I'll take 2 guards and take 4, Roderick said, "and seal Garrick's administrative offices. Nothing goes out. No correspondence, no courier pigeons, no household staff carrying anything larger than a handkerchief." He looked up from the map. His expression was the carefully composed blankness she'd seen in the village square. Not coldness, she understood now, but the face of a man who has decided that what he is feeling must wait until there is time to feel it properly. "I need to speak with the senior council, tonight." He looked at Mara. "You'll be present," he said. It wasn't a question either. She nodded once, and he left, and she stood alone in the round room with its windows on all sides, and the relief map of a kingdom that was right now balanced on the edge of something that could go in several very different directions. Outside the windows, the last of the afternoon light was giving way to the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere in the lower city, the lamplighters were beginning their rounds, the orange sparks appearing one by one in the darkening streets like a mirror of the stars beginning to emerge overhead. She looked at the frontier territories on the map, the pale brown of open land, the small copper pins marking the administrative posts, the empty space where Brindle Hollow would have been if someone had thought it important enough to mark. She pressed 2 fingers against that empty space. Then she straightened up and went to get ready for the senior council. The council chamber was on the 4th floor of the main tower, a room that had clearly been designed to impress upon everyone inside it the weight of institutional authority. Stone walls hung with the banners of every ruling house in the kingdom's recorded history, a long dark table of aged timber that had absorbed centuries of spilled ink and deliberated over decisions. High-backed chairs that were not quite thrones but were definitely not comfortable. Candelabras burning at both ends of the table, casting the kind of light that made everyone look simultaneously important and slightly sinister. There were 7 council members present when Mara entered with Brennan and Lyra. She recognized none of them by face, but she'd done enough reading in the library over the past 3 days to recognize them by type. The careful, formal posture of people who held significant administrative power and were accustomed to being the most informed people in any given room. Lord Garrick was not among them. The absence was both reassuring and immediately alarming. Roderick was already seated at the head of the table. He was back in his formal armor, she noticed. Not the full battle configuration, but the official court variant, the charcoal steel with the wolf crest, the clothing of the Alpha King rather than the man who ate dinner in his private rooms. He had made, deliberately or not, the choice to show up to this meeting as the monarch. Mara sat where Brennan indicated, to the left of the king, a position that was not a council seat but was clearly not an insignificant one. She felt the council members register this. She felt the recalibration run around the table like a current. "You've called an unscheduled council session," said the man immediately to Roderick's right, an older nobleman named Lord Cassidy Pell, who served as the chief judicial officer of the crown. He had the precise, contained manner of a lawyer who has learned that everything he says in a room like this will be examined later and is composing accordingly. "Under emergency charter provisions. The last time that was invoked was my father's funeral," Roderick said. "Yes, I'm aware." He looked around the table. "What I'm about to present to you cannot leave this room until I determine the appropriate process for public disclosure. If I find that it has, regardless of the channel, the source of that leak will be tried under Crown security statutes." A pause. "I want that understood completely before we begin." Complete silence around the table. Brennan laid the documents out. Lyra organized them in sequence. And Roderick, in the measured, precise language of a man who had clearly been composing this presentation in his head since the moment he left the map room, laid out the entirety of what they knew. He did not spare the details. He did not soften the numbers. He presented the full architecture of the theft, the routing, the diversion, the false records, the commercial alias, the secretary, the 7 years, with the systematic thoroughness of a military briefing, each element supported by the document behind it. When he reached the section on village clearances, the formal designation of non-compliant frontier settlements that had been the administrative lever used to eliminate villages that kept accurate enough records to notice the discrepancy, he paused once. Just once. And the pause said everything the formal language of the briefing couldn't. Around the table, the council absorbed it. Lord Pell had produced a small notebook partway through and was writing in it rapidly. 2 of the other council members had gone very still in the way of people receiving information that is reorganizing their understanding of events they thought they already understood. One older woman, Countess Era Toll, who oversaw the Crown's humanitarian administration, had closed her eyes briefly at the mention of village clearances and not reopened them for a full minute. When Roderick finished, the silence lasted longer than any of the silences in the map room had. Then Lord Pell said, "Where is Lord Garrick now?" "In his private apartments, under discreet watch," Roderick said. "I have not yet formally detained him. I wanted the council to review the evidence before I make that move." "You'll need more than commercial ledgers and a secretary's name to hold him under charter law," Pell said. "The chain of corporate alias to personal secretary to Lord Garrick himself. A defense counsel will argue it's circumstantial." "That's why we need Darren Kolst," Mara said. Every head at the table turned toward her. She had not been introduced, she realized. She was simply present, sitting beside the king, speaking without being invited to. The weight of 7 pairs of experienced, powerful eyes settling on her simultaneously was not a comfortable sensation. She did not let that show. "The secretary is the link," she continued in the same level voice she'd used in the map room. "His testimony, combined with the documents, converts circumstantial into conclusive. Without him, Lord Garrick can claim he knew nothing about his secretary's private commercial activities. With him, the chain is complete," Pell said slowly. He was looking at her with the evaluating attention of a lawyer encountering an argument he hadn't expected from the source presenting it. "Yes, you're right." A brief pause. "Who are you, exactly?" "She was the record keeper of Brindle Hollow," Roderick said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not protective exactly, but definitive. the tone of a man establishing a fact he will not have questioned. And she is the reason we have any of this. Lord Pell looked at her for another moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. Colst needs to be secured immediately, Pell said. Tonight. If Garrick's household has any way of communicating with him before, a knock at the chamber door. The kind of knock that interrupts rooms like this. Urgent, 2 sharp raps. The code of someone who would not have knocked at all if they'd had any choice about it. Roderick said, Enter. One of his personal guard opened the door. The guard was a young woman named Sella. Mara had noticed her on the journey from the frontier, precise and watchful, with the kind of quiet competence that tends to get people assigned to the innermost circle. Her expression right now was flat and controlled in a way that communicated to anyone trained to read such things that she was managing something serious. Captain Aldous sent me, Sella said. Darren Colst's rooms are empty. His personal effects are gone. The stable records show a horse was taken from the secondary yard approximately 40 minutes ago. The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences before it. This one had motion in it. The particular quality of a situation accelerating past the point where careful, deliberate planning was sufficient. Garrick had not waited for tomorrow. Tick. The next 3 hours were controlled chaos of the most refined kind. The kind that happens in institutions that have been managing crises for centuries and have developed, over that time, a series of protocols so practiced they can be executed half asleep. Pursuit riders were dispatched on all 3 routes east. The Keld Pass checkpoint was sent orders, by fast pigeon, to hold any traveler matching Colst's description. Garrick's apartments were formally sealed, his household staff questioned. The administrative offices were locked, and their document archives secured under Brennan's direct authority. Mara was not part of any of this. She was escorted back to the South Wing by Sella, who did it with the polite firmness of someone who has been told to remove a variable from the active equation. She went without argument, because arguing would have accomplished nothing and used energy she needed for thinking. She sat in her sitting room in the dark. She hadn't lit the lamp. And she thought, Colst was running. If they caught him, the chain was complete and Garrick was finished. If they didn't? If Garrick had planned this contingency thoroughly enough that Colst made it to the Eastern Territories or beyond the kingdom's jurisdiction, then the direct evidentiary link between the commercial account and the Lord was broken. Circumstantial wasn't nothing, but Pell was right. It wasn't enough to hold a senior royal family member under charter law without something more. She thought about what Garrick still had. He had 30 years of relationships. He had people in this building who owed their positions to him, people who would not necessarily move against him overtly, but would, quietly, slow walk. Miss file. Fail to find. Let 20 minutes become an hour at a key moment. He had the grand royal banquet. The thought arrived with sudden, arresting clarity. She sat forward in her chair. The banquet had been scheduled for 4 days from now, a seasonal court event, pre-planned, the entire senior nobility of the kingdom converging on Vane's hold for 2 days of formal meals and political ritual. She'd heard it mentioned in passing by Lyra as context for why certain administrative staff were particularly harried. At the time, it had been irrelevant background information. Now it sat in the center of her thinking like a stone with unexamined weight. If you were a man who had just lost control of the evidence against you, if you knew that within days your king would move to formally charge you, if you had spent 30 years building a network of influence throughout the kingdom's court, people who owed you things, people whose careers were tied to yours, people who understood that your fall would pull their own carefully constructed positions down with it, would you run? Or would you gather every piece of leverage you had, while every powerful person in the kingdom was conveniently assembled in one building, and move? She stood up. She lit the lamp. She went to find Brennan. She found him in the corridor outside the administrative offices, deep in conversation with 2 of his intelligence officers. He looked up when she approached, and she saw in his face the specific fatigue of a man who has been managing an accelerating crisis and is 3 problems ahead of everyone else in the room, except possibly the woman walking toward him. Colst? She said. No sign yet. The eastern checkpoint. Brennan. She cut him off, which she'd never done before, and he registered it. The banquet. He looked at her. Garrick isn't running, she said. He let Kolst run. He needed the link broken, but he's not going anywhere himself. He's been in this court for 30 years, and everything he is comes from that. She kept her voice low, though the corridor was empty. He's going to move at the banquet. Every senior noble in the kingdom under one roof. If he has allies who would benefit from a change in the order of succession. Brennan's expression had gone very still. If he moves at the banquet, she continued, it's not just about evidence anymore. It's not about documents and charter law. It's about whoever controls the room when the dust settles. A long pause. You think he'd move against Roderick directly, Brennan said. I think he's spent 7 years stealing from a kingdom to fund something, and I don't think that something is a comfortable retirement. She held his gaze. How long has he been regent capable? How long have the nobles who owe him their positions been in place? If Roderick is removed from the equation, don't, Brennan said sharply. I'm not wishing it. I'm naming the threat so we can... I know what you're doing. He ran one hand over his face, the gesture of a man encountering a scenario he'd been telling himself wasn't the scenario. The banquet security is managed by the court steward's office. Which reports to? A beat. Lord Garrick. Then whoever is planning the security for the banquet, Mara said quietly, is working for the man we're trying to stop. The corridor was very quiet. I need to tell Roderick, Brennan said. Yes, Mara said. Tonight. 4. She did not sleep that night. The conversation with Roderick happened without her. Brennan went alone because the practical reality of a frontier outsider requesting a private audience with the king at the second hour of the morning was a complication they didn't need. She understood this. She accepted it with the particular grace of someone who has learned to prioritize the outcome over their participation in it. But the hours between Brennan's departure and the dawn were very long. She sat at her writing table and wrote. She wrote everything. The full record of what she knew, organized and cited and cross-referenced, every number she'd memorized over 8 years of keeping records for a community that no longer existed. She wrote it not because she expected to need it in this form, but because writing had always been how she thought, and because if something happened to her before this was resolved, she wanted the information to exist somewhere outside her own head. She filled 11 pages before the light outside her window changed from black to gray. Around the 5th hour, a note arrived, slipped under her door. She recognized Roderick's handwriting because she'd seen it on the directive documents Brennan had shown her. Firm, economical, the handwriting of a man who writes to communicate rather than to perform. Security for the banquet is being restructured under Brennan's direct command. You were right. R. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it under the inkwell on her desk. You were right. 3 words from the Alpha King, written in the second hour of the morning, and she was surprised to find that they hit her somewhere more personal than she'd expected. Not because she'd needed his validation, she'd been right before anyone confirmed it, and she'd known she was right, but because of what the words represented. The particular intimacy of being believed. The specific weight of having a powerful person set aside their own comfort and say, the thing you told me was true. She had not been believed by the first 3 people she'd tried to tell about Brindle Hollow. 2 soldiers and a checkpoint officer who had looked at her, ash-covered, bandaged, clearly a frontier woman of no institutional standing, and had seen exactly what they expected to see. She laid her hand flat on the note for a moment. Then she went back to writing. The 4 days before the banquet moved with the particular illusory slowness of time under pressure, each hour seeming simultaneously very long and very short, the hours accumulating into days that felt both interminable and insufficient. Brennan rebuilt the banquet security from the ground up. He brought in his own intelligence officers to manage the entry points and replaced the guest management staff with people he'd vetted personally. It was done quietly and explained to the inevitable court inquiries as a standard security review ahead of a large gathering, the kind of explanation that was technically true and revealed nothing. Garrick conspicuously did not object. That was the part that kept Mara awake. His silence, his continued, apparently serene presence at court, attending the usual functions, visible at the appropriate meals, conducting himself with the unruffled composure of a man who has nothing to answer for. He had been formally informed that his administrative offices were under audit. He had been formally interviewed by Lord Pell's judicial officers and had answered every question with the carefully cooperative performance of a man who found the inquiry slightly puzzling but was happy to help in any way he could. He was very good at it. She watched him at the court dinner on the second day from a distance. She had not been invited to court dinners and was not attempting to attend them, but the main hall's gallery had a window that looked down on the dining room below, and she had found reasons to walk past it at useful times. Garrick sat 3 seats from Roderick, eating with appetite, conversing with the nobles on either side of him, laughing at something someone said with the relaxed warmth of a man completely at ease. She watched his hands. She watched his eyes. She watched the way they moved around the room in the pauses between conversations. Quick, cataloging, the eyes of someone taking inventory. He was counting his pieces. He was running the odds. The question she couldn't answer, the one that kept the sleepless hours filled, was, what were his pieces? Who, among the nobles and officials converging on the hold for the banquet, owed Garrick enough to act on that debt? Were they people who would act knowing what he was, or people who had been given a different story, a story in which Roderick was the problem and Garrick was the solution? She didn't know. She couldn't know. She had 11 pages of grain records, and grain records told her nothing about the human architecture of a political conspiracy. On the evening of the third day, Roderick called her to his private study. He was alone, not even Brennan, just the two of them in a room lined with books and maps and the small iron stove that kept the high-floor rooms warm against the night cold coming off the mountains. It was the most informal setting she'd seen him in, and the informality felt deliberate. He poured 2 cups of something from a small ceramic jug on the mantelpiece and set one in front of her without asking. She picked it up, a dark spiced wine, warmer than the room, and waited. "The investigation into Colt's disappearance has turned up something," he said. He was standing at his desk, not sitting, which she'd come to understand was how he moved when he was dealing with something that made stillness difficult. His horse was found at a way station on the northern route, not the eastern route. He didn't go to the trading post or the eastern territories. She frowned. "Then where?" "He doubled back." Roderick's voice was controlled and careful. "He went north, switched horses at the way station, and came back on the river road. He's in Keldrath, the city, below the hold." "Garrick brought him back," Mara said slowly. "Which means Cole's disappearance was theater," Roderick said. "It was meant to make us think the link was broken, that Garrick's direct evidentiary connection to the scheme had run. While we were dispatching pursuit riders east, Colst was riding north, and now he's in the city, hidden somewhere in Garrick's network, which means he's not a loose end that needed cutting," Mara said. "He's an asset that needed relocating." Roderick looked at her. "Why would Garrick keep Colst close?" she said, thinking as she spoke. "If you're planning to run, you cut every link. You leave nothing behind. But if you're planning to stay, if you're planning to move against someone, you keep your most dangerous piece close to the board." She looked at the desk. She looked at the map on the wall, the same relief image of the kingdom she'd studied in the map room. "Colst knows where the money went, not just the grain diversion, the conversion to capital, the account balances. If Garrick has been building a war chest..." She stopped. She looked at Roderick. He was looking back at her with the expression she'd learned to read as the face of a man already there, already at the conclusion, waiting to see if she'd arrive at the same place. "He's been funding something," she said. "The grain theft isn't just personal enrichment. 7 years is too long and too systematic for simple greed. There's a specific purpose." She felt the shape of it assembling in her mind the way information assembles when you've been circling it long enough and suddenly the angle shifts. "Who would benefit if you were gone?" "There are several theoretical succession candidates," Roderick said carefully. "Most of them have been deliberately kept without power. My father understood the importance of..." "But one of them is not kept without power," Mara said. "One of them has, for the past 7 years, had access to a private treasury built on stolen grain. One of them has had 30 years of Garrick's loyalty and Garrick's network and Garrick's knowledge of this court." She looked at him directly. "Who is it?" A pause. "My cousin," Roderick said. "Prince Davon Vane, my father's sister's son. He is currently in residence at his estate in the Eastern Territories." Another pause, measured and careful. 2 days hard ride from Keldrath. 2 days. The banquet was in one day. She set down the cup of spiced wine. He's already coming, she said. Garrick invited him, under whatever pretext, a courtesy invitation to the seasonal banquet, something plausible enough that it registered as normal. He's already on the road. Roderick was very still. Brennan needs to know, she said. Brennan already knows, Roderick said quietly. I told him an hour ago. He's already moved to intercept on the eastern approach road. A beat. But Davin has his own guard. 50 riders. If he decides not to be intercepted, then by tomorrow night he'll be at the gates of Keldrath with 50 armed men and a claim to the throne, and the most important gathering of nobles in the kingdom will be seated in your great hall. She heard her own voice, level, precise, the record-keeper's voice that could recite 8 years of figures without wavering, and was distantly grateful for it. This is the banquet, Roderick. This is the moment he chose. Everything about it. The timing, the nobility, the security apparatus controlled by Garrick, Davan's approach from the east, Kolst hidden in the city with the financial records. She looked at him. It's one move. It's all one move. And it happens tomorrow night. The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had before. Those had been the silences of two people learning each other, navigating the careful distances imposed by circumstance. This one was something else. The silence of two people standing in the same place at the same time, looking at the same thing, the distance between them smaller than either had noticed it becoming. I can cancel the banquet, Roderick said. Which accomplishes what? She asked. Davan is still coming. The nobles go home, and in 6 months he tries again with a more prepared ground. She shook her head. You can't cancel this. You have to win it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. The complicated, layered something that had been present since the village square, since the world had tilted on its axis, and neither of them had had the space or the language to address what it meant. You should leave, he said. Tomorrow, before the banquet. I can have horses ready at the western gate at dawn. You can be 2 days' ride from here before anything. No, she said. Mara, no. The word was quiet and absolute. These people died because someone used your name and your power and your army to erase the evidence of their crime. The truth about what happened to them. The full truth. Not a judicial record buried in an archive somewhere, but the truth spoken out loud in front of every noble in this kingdom. That is the only thing that makes their deaths mean something. She held his gaze. I'm not leaving. He looked at her with the amber eyes that had found her in the ash, and called her something his instincts recognized. She felt the pull of it, that inexplicable, bone-deep there. And for the first time since the village square, she did not categorize it as something to be filed away for later consideration. You could be killed, he said. I could have been killed 3 days ago in the ruins of my home, she said. The difference is that here, I'd be killed for something that mattered. A long pause. Then Roderick said, very quietly, Stay close to Brennan tomorrow night. I intend to, she said. The night before the banquet, she did not sleep again. But this time, the wakefulness had a different quality. Not the hollow, ash-gray insomnia of grief, but the taut, focused alertness of a person who has identified what is coming and is preparing to meet it. She rewrote her 11 pages in clean order. She reviewed every number, every name, every date. She thought through every scenario she could construct for how tomorrow night might go, and for each scenario she constructed a response. She thought about Roderick. She thought about the bond. The word for it had come to her eventually, in the quiet reading she'd done in the Hold's library, in the careful, oblique way she'd searched the old frontier texts for a description of what she'd felt in the village square, the alpha bond, the mate recognition, the resonant, irreducible recognition that some part of two people had reached across the space between them and said, this one. This is the one. She thought about the fact that she had come to this city as a prisoner, carrying grief like a stone in her chest, furious and exhausted and stripped of everything except the truth she carried in her memory, and that somewhere in the days since, the stone had not gone away. It would not go away, she didn't think, not entirely, not for a very long time. But something else had grown alongside it, something she hadn't planned for and hadn't had the space to examine, and would have to keep not examining for at least one more day, until the banquet was over and the crisis was resolved and she could afford to think about something that wasn't survival. Outside her window, Keldrath was quiet. The lights in the lower city had gone out one by one as the night deepened, until only the occasional lamp of a night watch or an insomniac baker remained. The river caught the moonlight and held it, silver and patient, moving over its stones. Tomorrow the great hall of Vane's Hold would be full of nobility, and somewhere in the city below, a hidden secretary held the records of a conspiracy, and somewhere on the eastern road, 50 riders were moving through the dark. Mara Vale, who had been the record keeper of a village that no longer existed, picked up her pen and wrote the last entry on the 12th page. Names of the confirmed dead, Brindle Hollow, listed in full. She wrote all 411. She wrote Helva, age 81. She wrote the Aldrich family. She wrote every farmer and craftsperson and tradesperson and schoolchild she could name, in the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who understood that memory is its own form of survival. She wrote Fen, 6 weeks old, 8 pounds, 4 ounces. She finished as the first pale edge of dawn appeared above the mountains to the east. She set down her pen. She laid the 12 pages flat and weighted them with the inkwell and sat back in her chair. The great hall would be lit by 1,000 candles tonight. The finest nobles in the kingdom would be seated at its long tables. And somewhere in the choreography of that gathering, in the moments between toasts and formalities, in the shadows between the lit candelabras, in the gap between the world everyone in that room thought they were living in and the world that was actually arriving, something was going to break open. She could feel it the way a frontier woman feels weather coming in off the mountains. The particular pressure change in the air, the way the light has a different quality. The animal certainty that whatever the sky looks like right now, it is not what the sky is about to look like. She stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She had 11 hours. She intended to use every one of them. Hashem. The banquet began at the 7th hour of the evening. The great hall of Vane's Hold was, Mara had to admit, exactly the kind of room designed to make human beings feel simultaneously elevated and insignificant. Soaring vaulted ceilings with the crests of 4 ruling generations carved in the stone. A floor of polished dark granite that reflected the light of approximately 800 candles burning in 3 massive iron chandeliers overhead. Long tables set in a horseshoe configuration, draped in white linen and set with the crown's formal silver. Enough gleaming tableware to equip a small army. The nobility had been arriving since mid-afternoon. She'd watched from her window as the carriages came up the hill in a procession. Banners and outriders, and the particular theatrical quality of powerful people performing their arrival for each other's benefit. She was not seated at the main tables. She had expected this, and she had also expected that it would be used against her, that her absence from the formal configuration would be read by anyone who noticed as confirmation of her status as something between prisoner and inconvenience, certainly not someone whose voice in this room would carry weight. She had factored this into her thinking. What she had not factored was Lyra. The archivist appeared at her door at the 6th hour, slightly out of breath, carrying a garment draped over her arm. A deep blue dress of the kind worn by senior administrative staff at formal court functions, clearly borrowed from someone slightly taller than Mara, which meant it was only slightly too long. "There's a seat at the staff table in the East Gallery," Lyra said. "It has sight lines to the entire main floor. I had it added to the seating arrangement this afternoon under my archival authority, which technically allows me to requisition gallery space for documentation purposes during formal court events." She held out the dress. "Brennan knows you'll be there. Sella will be at the East Gallery door." Mara looked at her. "Lyra." "Put the dress on," Lyra said, with the efficient firmness of a woman who has thought this through and is not interested in arguments. "And eat something first. You've barely eaten today." Mara took the dress. By the 7th hour, she was seated in the East Gallery, the formal blue dress only slightly pooling at her feet, a clean line of sight across the railing to the full floor of the great hall below. She could see Roderick at the head of the horseshoe, in full formal regalia now, the wolf crest breastplate, the crimson sash of the ruling house, the composed, commanding presence of the Alpha King in his proper theater. She could see Lord Garrick seated 4 places down on the left arm of the table, in conversation with a nobleman she didn't recognize, completely relaxed. She scanned the room. Brennan had placed his intelligence people at the serving stations. She could identify them by the small, specific way they stood differently from the actual household staff, the weight slightly forward, the eyes moving. She counted 8. She found Selah at the East Gallery door as promised. She did not find anything wrong. For 2 hours, nothing was wrong. The courses came and went. The toasts were given in the elaborate formulaic language of crown formal events. The conversation at the tables had the overlapping, acoustic complexity of a large group of people performing sociability at high volume. She watched Garrick. He was the calmest person in the room. At the 3rd hour of the banquet, a man she didn't recognize entered from the servants' corridor at the north end of the hall and began moving along the wall toward the kitchen passage. He was dressed as a server. He was not one of Brennan's people. She noticed because he moved wrong. Not badly wrong. He was trained, whoever he was, trained well enough that to anyone not specifically watching for it, he looked entirely plausible. But she had spent 2 hours cataloging the movement patterns of every person in this room, and this man's pattern was different in one specific way. He was not moving toward anywhere food or drink needed to go. He was moving toward the corridor that connected the great hall to the internal staircase, the staircase that led to the hold's private upper floors. She stood up. Selah was at the gallery door in 3 steps. "What?" "North corridor," Mara said quietly, pointing. Gray server's uniform, dark hair, has not approached any of the tables. Moving toward the internal stairs. Selah looked, found the man. Her hand went immediately to the short blade at her hip, and she was already turning to signal someone across the gallery when Mara grabbed her arm. "Wait." She looked at the man again, and then she looked at the room, at the tables, at the servers, at the very specific way the people dressed as serving staff were distributed around the hall. She counted, and her count was wrong. She had 8 of Brennan's people. She had approximately 30 actual household staff, and there were, she now realized, at least a dozen additional figures in server's livery that she had not accounted for in either group. "They're already in the room," she said. The cold clarity of it was almost physical. "He didn't need to bring people in. They've been here all night, mixed in with the actual staff." Selah's face went white. "How many?" Selah said. "At least 12. Probably more." Downstairs at the head table, she saw Roderick turn to say something to the nobleman beside him, the composed, ordinary motion of a man at a formal dinner. He did not know yet. He was sitting at the center of it, and he did not know yet. And then she saw Garrick. Garrick was no longer watching the room. He was watching his cup. He was waiting. Mara looked around the East Gallery, and she made, in the space of approximately 3 seconds, the calculation that she had been making all her life in various forms. The same calculation a frontier woman makes when the weather changes faster than expected, when the trapline goes wrong, when the thing you planned for turns out to be not quite the thing that's actually happening. You do not have the resources you wished for. You do not have the time you planned for. You have what you have, and the window in which you can use it is closing. She did not wait for it to close. She turned to Selah. "Get to Brennan. Tell him the infiltration is already inside. Get every one of his people to the 4 corners of the floor, and do not let anyone reach those internal stairs." She was already moving toward the gallery door. "And tell him I'm going to the floor." "You can't go to the—" "Someone has to tell Roderick before Garrick gives the signal," Mara said. "And the only person in this building who can walk to the head table without stopping is me." She did not wait for Selah's answer. She went through the gallery door, down the east staircase, and into the great hall of Vane's Hold. The noise of 800 candles and 400 voices surrounded her like a warm, terrible wall. She moved through the periphery of the room with her eyes forward, threading between servers and guests with the purposeful, unhurried pace of someone who belongs where they're going. She kept Roderick in her sightline. She kept Garrick in her peripheral vision. Garrick had not moved. He was still watching his cup. She was 20 feet from the head table when one of the infiltrators, the man from the north corridor, who had not apparently been intercepted, stepped directly into her path. He was not holding a weapon. Not yet. But his eyes, meeting hers, were the eyes of a man who has been given specific instructions about what to do if someone who isn't supposed to be on this floor shows up walking towards the head table with the expression of someone who knows what's happening. "Wrong section, miss," he said. His voice was pleasant. His hand closed around her elbow. Mara looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at the head table, where Roderick was 15 feet away, still in conversation, still unaware. She looked at Garrick, whose eyes had lifted from his cup, whose eyes were now on her. And in that moment, in the specific crystalline instant when Garrick's gaze found her and registered her presence on the floor with an expression that moved from calculation to decision in the space of a heartbeat, she understood that the signal was not coming. The signal was her. Her presence on the floor, walking toward the king, was the moment Garrick had been waiting for. Not because she was the threat, because stopping her was the pretext. The thing that would look to 400 witnesses like a legitimate security response, and in the chaos of that response, in the confusion of a woman being forcibly removed from a formal royal banquet, the other pieces would move. She had walked into it, and she had about 4 seconds before it started. She did the only thing she could do. She opened her mouth and she used the voice she'd developed over 8 years of calling roll in a village square, projecting across open ground and frontier wind, making herself heard over the noise of harvest and weather and 400 living human beings. Your Majesty. The great hall of Vane's Hold went silent, not gradually, not in a wave spreading outward from the source. All at once, the specific total silence of 400 people who have heard something that does not belong in the sound world they were inhabiting and have collectively, instinctively stopped to identify it. In that silence, Mara Vale looked directly at Alpha King Roderick Vane across 15 feet of polished granite floor and candlelight, and she said, clearly and completely and without a tremor in her voice, "The men in Server's livery are not your staff. There are at least 12 of them. They are armed, and they are positioned around this hall, and the signal to move has not yet been given." She did not look away from Roderick. She felt the hand on her elbow tighten. She let it. Lord Garrick, now would be the time. The man beside her moved, and the great hall exploded. The man beside her moved, and Mara moved first. Not away, toward. She dropped her weight and twisted into him instead of pulling back, the way she'd learned on the frontier where predators teach you that running triggers the chase. The hand on her elbow lost its grip because her elbow was no longer where it expected to find it, and she was already past him, 3 steps toward the head table, when the first real sound of chaos broke behind her. It was not the clean, cinematic sound of a battle starting. It was the specific, terrible sound of a formal dinner coming apart. The crash of overturned silver, the sharp scrape of chairs on granite, a woman's voice cutting upward through the noise in a single sustained note of alarm that seemed to pull the entire room into a different reality. The candlelight, which had been warm and still and civilized, was suddenly fractured by motion, bodies rising, turning, the shadows lurching as the chandelier swayed in the disturbed air. Roderick was on his feet. He had been on his feet, she would understand later, from the moment she'd shouted his name, the same instant instinct that had landed him in full battle awareness in a single heartbeat. By the time she'd taken 3 steps, he was already over the table, not around it, vaulting the formal linen and the formal silver with zero ceremony and landing on the floor between her and the nearest converging figure in false livery. The figure had a short blade drawn. Roderick's long knife was in his hand before the blade cleared its sheath. "Mara," he said, not looking at her, his attention entirely on the 3 men now moving toward them from different angles. "Behind me." "There are 12, she said, "possibly more at the exits." "I heard you the first time." What happened next was not something she could reconstruct cleanly afterward. It was too fast and too loud and too full of the specific confusion of a large space in which something violent was happening in multiple places simultaneously. She had a clear picture of Roderick in the seconds immediately following. The way he fought was not like the theatrical violence of the stories she'd read, not the formal choreographed exchange of a duel. It was economical and immediate and terrifyingly efficient, the fighting style of a man who has internalized damage control to such a degree that he moves through conflict the way water moves through rock, finding the line of least resistance and exploiting it completely. He took the first man with 1 motion, the second required 2. The third came from her left, and she grabbed the nearest thing on the table, a heavy silver serving platter, and used it the way a person from the frontier uses whatever's at hand, which is without hesitation and without apology. The third man went down. Roderick looked at her over his shoulder for exactly 1 second. Behind me, he said again. I just handled the third one, she said. Something moved in his expression that was not quite the moment for whatever it was, but registered anyway. Then Brennan's people hit the floor from all four corners, and the calculus of the room changed entirely. The fight lasted 11 minutes. She knew this precisely because the Great Hall's formal clock, a massive, ornate mechanism on the north wall, the kind of timekeeping instrument that exists primarily to remind everyone in the room that history is watching, was visible from where she stood, and she tracked it with the compulsive exactness of a woman who has always measured things because measurement is how you maintain control of a world that wants to be chaotic. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, 8 of Garrick's infiltrators were subdued. 2 escaped toward the kitchen passage and were caught on the stairs by guards who had been placed there specifically because Mara had told Brennan to put people there. 2 others had apparently reassessed their prospects and made the practical decision to set down their weapons without requiring anyone to make a point of it. The nobility of the kingdom, for their part, had responded to the chaos in the particular spectrum of ways that very powerful people respond to physical danger when they haven't expected it, ranging from the man who had immediately moved to protect the woman beside him and then spent the entire 11 minutes in a low defensive crouch with a dinner knife, to the 3 noblewomen who had retreated in perfect formation to the far end of the hall and proceeded to observe events with the focused, assessing attention of people who understand that what they're watching will be politically significant and intend to have an accurate account of it. Lady Vera Colton was among the 3. She was watching Mara. Garrick had not moved. This was the thing that Mara kept returning to in the fractured, multi-tracked awareness of the 11 minutes. Garrick had not moved. He sat in his place at the table, hands flat on the linen, with the composed stillness of a man who had concluded that his best remaining option was to become as small and ordinary as possible. The performance of a person who had nothing to do with this, who was, like everyone else, simply a witness to a disturbance. It was a very good performance. It wasn't good enough. When the last of the infiltrators had been secured and Brennan's people held the floor, and the initial crackling chaos of the room had settled into the lower frequency tension of aftermath, Roderick turned to face his uncle across the length of the Great Hall. The room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet during the fighting. This was a different silence, heavy, anticipatory, the silence of 400 people who understood that they were about to see something that would be spoken of for the rest of their lives. "Lord Garrick," Roderick said. His voice carried perfectly. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. The room had organized itself around it the way rooms organize themselves around the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding how to use authority. Garrick looked up from the table. "My king," he said. His voice was steady. She had to give him that. "Stand up," Roderick said. A pause. The pause of a man making a final calculation. Then Garrick stood, slowly, with the dignity of someone who intends to manage the manner of their defeat, even when the defeat itself is no longer in question. "You'll want to be careful here," Garrick said. His voice was pitched for the room now, not just for Roderick, the deliberate public performance of a man who still believes he has an audience to work. Accusations made in the heat of a security incident, without due process. The due process, Brennan said from across the room, is documented in 17 sets of transit records, 12 seasons of payment receipt cross-references, a commercial account registered to your personal secretary under a concealed name, and the full testimony of the record keeper of Brindle Hollow, who memorized 8 years of frontier grain data while standing in the ashes of her village. He walked forward as he spoke, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been quiet for a long time and is now finished being quiet. "The process is done, Lord Garrick. The only question remaining is what you'd like to say before it concludes." Garrick looked at Brennan. He looked at Roderick. He looked, finally, at Mara. And the look lasted long enough that she had time to read it fully. Not hatred, she thought. Not even contempt. Something more specific and more honest than either of those. The particular expression of a man confronting the specific instrument of his undoing and understanding clearly how it had happened. She had been an ash-covered woman in a ruined village, and he had not considered her a variable worth accounting for. He didn't say anything else. The formal arrest of Lord Garrick Vane was conducted by Lord Pell, who had emerged from behind the overturned table he'd apparently sheltered under during the 11 minutes with his judicial notebook still in hand, and had wasted no time establishing the appropriate procedural framework. It was done with a precision that Mara found, under the circumstances, almost absurd. The careful language of charter law, the formal witnesses, the specific articulation of charges. But she also understood, watching Pell's steady, deliberate performance, that the formality was not absurd. The formality was the point. The formality was what separated this from the kind of justice that could later be called by another name. She had thought about that in the long nights before the banquet. She had thought about the difference between what had been done to Brindle Hollow, which had used the appearance of legal authority to cover an act of destruction, and what she wanted, which was not the mirror image of that, which was not the use of grief and fury to destroy a man without process, however much the grief and fury were justified. She wanted him to stand in front of every person in that room and be named. She wanted the names of her dead spoken in front of witnesses who could not look away. She got that. Not yet. Not tonight. In the immediate aftermath of the chaos. But Pell's careful formality was the machinery that would produce it, and she stood in the great hall of Vane's hold and watched the machinery begin, and felt something inside her begin, very slowly, very slightly, to release. Prince Davin Vane arrived at the eastern gate of Keldrath at the second hour after midnight with 49 riders, one short of his original complement because one of his outriders had, apparently, taken ill on the road. The outrider, it turned out, had been intercepted by Brennan's people at the Greenvale Junction and had been extremely forthcoming under very little pressure about the nature of the prince's journey, his instructions from Garrick, and the specific signal he'd been carrying. A sealed letter with Garrick's personal stamp, addressed to the commander of the hold's South Gate, whose name was on a list of officials who had accepted Garrick's patronage over the years. With the letter intercepted and the gate commander quietly removed from his post an hour before the prince arrived, Prince Devon rode to a gate that was staffed by 4 of Brennan's people and 0 of his uncles. He was escorted with his 49 riders to the outer courtyard. He was informed by Lord Pell himself in the cold midnight air of his uncle's arrest and the charges against him. And Prince Davon Vane, who was 26 years old and had apparently been cultivated and managed and directed by his uncle's long-term planning since childhood without ever being quite told the full shape of the game he was a piece in, sat on his horse in the outer courtyard and said nothing for a very long time. Then he dismounted. He handed his sword to Lord Pell. He said, "I want to speak to the king." That conversation happened without Mara. She didn't try to be present for it. It was a private thing, a family thing in the painful and complicated way of families that have allowed power to grow between them until it warps the shape of every relationship. She imagined Roderick in a room with his young cousin, listening, asking, deciding. She imagined the particular difficulty of looking at a person who had been aimed at you and understanding that the aim was not their idea. She sat in the east gallery of the great hall, which was quiet now, most of the candles burned to their bases, and she let the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay for days come in. It came in very fully. Lyra found her there an hour after midnight, carrying 2 cups of actual tea, not the working variety, but something warmer and less purposeful, and sat down beside her without speaking for a while. The great hall below them was being quietly restored by household staff who moved through the candlelit space with the efficient professional calm of people who have been trained to deal with the aftermath of events without editorializing about the events themselves. "The 12 pages, Lyra said eventually. Mara looked at her. "The 12 pages you wrote last night," Lyra said. "The names, I'd like to include them in the formal record of the investigation as an official exhibit." She paused. "With your permission." Mara was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the great hall, at the restored tables, the dying candles, the polished dark floor that had been a battlefield 11 minutes ago and was now simply a floor again. "Yes," she said. They sat together in the quiet until the last of the candles in the chandeliers below guttered out. The week following the banquet was, in its own way, harder than the banquet itself. The banquet had been crisis, defined, immediate, demanding the particular focused clarity that emergency generates. What followed was the long, complicated, unglamorous work of consequence. The judicial proceedings, The investigation's formal conclusion, the administrative unwinding of 7 years of institutional corruption, the specific, exhausting process of figuring out what was broken and what it would take to fix it. Mara was in the middle of all of it, not formally. She held no title, no office, no institutional standing within the Crown's structure. But Brennan had learned, somewhere between the map room and the banquet floor, to treat her presence in any given process not as an anomaly to be managed, but as a resource to be used. And Lord Pell had developed in the careful, evaluating way of a lawyer who respects a clear argument regardless of its source, something that operated in practice as collaborative trust. She sat in on the evidence reviews. She answered the judicial panel's questions with the same level precision she'd used in the tent on the first night, citing figures and dates and names from 8 years of memorized records. She helped Lara construct the full accounting, village by village, season by season, the complete picture of what had been taken and from whom over 7 years of systematic diversion. The number, when they finally had it complete, was staggering. 41 villages, Lyra said, on the 4th day after the banquet, reading the final tally in the flat voice of someone delivering a figure they cannot quite believe their own careful arithmetic has produced. Over 7 years, the total diverted grain converted to currency at the Eastern Trading Post prices. She stopped. It's enough to fund a private army for 3 years. Which was the plan, Brennan said. He was standing at the window of the archive room, looking out at the morning. The money went to Davin's estate accounts. He's confirmed it. He thought it was his uncle's legitimate investment management, his inheritance being stewarded. He didn't ask detailed questions because Garrick had always managed the money and Garrick told him the accounts were performing well. A pause. He was 22 when this started. His uncle told him what to think, and he thought it. What happens to him? Mara asked. That's the king's decision, Brennan said. She did not see Roderick for 3 days after the banquet. She understood this too. The particular demands of the days following a political crisis, the institutional machinery that required the king's attention in a dozen simultaneous directions, the careful public management of what had happened and what it meant. She was not owed his time and she didn't request it, but she was aware of his absence in the way you're aware of a change in atmospheric pressure, not painfully, not urgently, but as a constant, low-level alteration in the quality of the air around her. On the 4th day, Sella delivered a note. The council meets tomorrow morning to hear the formal charges. I'd like you there. She was there. The council chamber was full. Every senior member present, plus Lord Pell and his 2 judicial officers, plus Brennan, plus Lyra, with her documents arranged in precise order on the table before her. Garrick was brought in under guard and seated at the far end of the table, which had been cleared of everything except the document stack that represented 7 years of his work in reverse. He looked the same. That was the first thing she noticed. He had the appearance of a man who had maintained himself carefully in the days since his arrest, who had not allowed his circumstances to unmake the presentation of himself that had served him for 30 years. The silver hair, the correct posture, the composed expression. He sat down in the chair as if he were attending a regular council meeting rather than his own formal accusation. He looked at Mara once, briefly, when she entered. She met his gaze and held it, and then looked away first. Not from discomfort, but because he was not the most important person in the room, and she was done spending attention on him that could be spent on something that mattered. Lord Pell read the charges in full. It took 20 minutes. He read them in the specific, unembellished language of judicial process. No drama, no rhetoric. Each charge supported by its evidentiary reference. The full architecture of 7 years dismantled and named in the flat, relentless vocabulary of legal accountability. When he finished, Garrick said, I'd like to address the council. You'll have that opportunity at the formal hearing, Pell said. I'd like to address it now. He looked at Roderick, not at Pell, in the direct, specific way of a man who understands that the only conversation that matters in this room is the one between him and the person at its head. Roderick, you've listened to one account of what happened. I'd like you to hear mine. Roderick was quiet for a moment, then, go ahead. Something moved in the room, a collective, held breath. Garrick looked at his hands on the table. When your father died, he said, You were 22 years old. You were a soldier. You were brilliant at it, and I will say that without reservation, but you were not a king. You did not understand how this kingdom actually functions. The real machinery of it, the parts that don't appear in governance texts. Your father had spent 30 years building relationships, balances, arrangements that held things together in ways that weren't visible unless you'd built them. He paused. I spent 2 years as regent, 2 years holding this kingdom together while you learned what it meant to rule. The methods I used during that time were not all methods I would have chosen if I'd had the luxury of choosing. Some of them were already in motion before I inherited oversight of them. Some of them I continued because the alternative was to dismantle a functioning system without having a replacement ready. And the consequences of that, 41 villages, Mara said. The room went very still. She had not been asked to speak. She was not a council member, not a judicial officer, not a person with any formal standing in this proceeding. She said it anyway, in the same quiet, level voice she'd used for everything since the village square, because Garrick was performing justification, and she was not willing to let it go unanswered. 41 villages, she said again, over 7 years. Children who went hungry because the grain they produced was diverted before it reached the crown's distribution system. Families who paid their taxes and then were told they hadn't. Communities that were burned to protect a secret because it was more convenient to erase them than to stop taking from them. She looked at him directly. What was the alternative you were protecting them from? Garrick looked at her. And for the first time since the village square, she watched the composure actually fail him. Not dramatically. Not a collapse. Not tears. Nothing that could be characterized as remorse. Just a slight, involuntary contraction around the eyes of a man encountering a question he cannot answer with the vocabulary he has available. Because the vocabulary he had available was the vocabulary of politics and power and historical necessity, and the complex justifications that power generates for itself over 30 years of use. And her question lived in a different language entirely. He did not answer it. Roderick looked at his uncle for a long moment. The formal hearing will be scheduled for the end of the week, he said. His voice was even and measured and carried beneath the evenness the specific quality of something decided. Until then, you'll remain in your apartments under guard. A pause. Is there anything you want to say to me directly before this becomes entirely a matter for judicial process? Garrick looked at him. Something moved across the older man's face, something that Mara thought might have been the closest he was capable of coming to grief, though she wasn't certain grief was the right word for it. The expression of a man confronting the full size of what he'd lost, which was not just his position or his freedom, but the relationship he'd apparently valued enough to spend 30 years corrupting it. I built this kingdom alongside your father, Garrick said quietly. I kept it standing when he was gone. I believed I was... He stopped. I believed I was protecting it. You were stealing from it, Roderick said. The sentence was simple. It was not cruel, but it was absolute, and it left no room for the frame Garrick had been trying to build around his actions. Garrick looked at the table. He said nothing else. The formal hearing took 3 days and produced a verdict that the kingdom would discuss for years, not because it was unexpected, but because of the specific nature of the sentence. Mara was present for the reading of it. She stood at Brennan's right in the formal witness gallery, Lyra on her other side. The 12 pages of Brindle Hollow's name dead entered officially into the judicial record as Exhibit 17. Lord Pell read the verdict in the same measured, unembellished voice he'd used throughout. The charges were sustained on all counts. The evidence was found complete and sufficient. The judicial panel had deliberated for 6 hours and reached its conclusions unanimously. Then Roderick stood. He was in full formal regalia. He had been sitting throughout the proceedings in the witness position rather than the head position, having recused himself from the panel to avoid the appearance of direct royal influence on the verdict. But the sentencing, under Crown Charter, the specific sentencing in cases of royal family treason, was the king's alone. Lord Garrick Vane, he said, by the laws of this kingdom and by the authority of the crown, I am required to impose a sentence commensurate with the severity of your offenses, which include the systemic theft of crown resources, the corruption of frontier administrative authority, the falsification of official documents, and the conspiracy that resulted in the destruction of 41 frontier communities and the deaths of an as yet not fully counted number of their inhabitants. He paused. The law allows for execution. The law also allows for alternatives, in cases where the council has determined that alternatives serve justice equally or more effectively. Another pause. I'm exercising that allowance. The gallery was perfectly silent. You will be removed from all crown titles, properties, and privileges, Roderick said. You will be confined to the estate of Varen in the Eastern Territories under permanent house arrest. You will have no contact with crown officials, no correspondence outside monitored channels, no visitors except those specifically approved by the judicial office. He held Garrick's gaze across the length of the chamber. And for as long as I am king, the restoration of the 41 villages you destroyed will be conducted under your name, not in your honor, but as your record. Every settlement rebuilt, every family compensated, every community restored will be documented as part of the accounting of what Garrick Vane took and was required to give back. Your name will be attached to the reparation until it's complete. He sat down. The chamber absorbed it. Garrick, across the room, was looking at Roderick with an expression that had shed its composure entirely now, finally, here at the end of the formal proceedings. What was on his face was not quite what she'd expected. Not anger, not despair. It was something more complicated and more honest. The expression of a man who has just been handed a sentence that is worse, in the specific way it is designed, than anything he'd prepared to receive, because it does not allow him to become simply gone. It requires him to remain, to witness, to be perpetually present in the accounting of what he'd done. Mara looked at that expression for a moment. Then she looked away. She had already decided, by the time the hearing concluded, that she was going home. Not home to anything that currently existed. Brindle Hollow was ash, and would be for some time yet, and the process of rebuilding it was a long, material, unglamorous challenge that she'd begun thinking about with the same systematic thoroughness she'd brought to the grain records. But home to the place, the thornwood and the river and the particular quality of the western frontier light, which was broader and flatter than the mountain-influenced light here, and which she had not realized she was homesick for until she walked through the Hold's western gate one evening and looked at the sunset and thought, it's not quite the right color. She was packing. The few things she'd accumulated in the south wing rooms, the 12 pages folded carefully into the inner pocket of her coat, when the knock came at her door. She knew the footsteps. She'd known them for days. Come in, she said. Roderick stood in the doorway. He was not in formal armor. He was in the simpler clothes she'd come to associate with the end of his official day, dark shirt, no crest, the version of him that existed when the performance of the king could be set down. He looked at the packed bag on the chair. West, he said. Yes. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, in the posture of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. She continued folding methodically, giving him the time. The rebuilding of the frontier communities will require administrative oversight, he said. It will require someone who understands the territory, understands the communities, and is trusted by the people who survive them. A pause. I'm creating a new position, Frontier Restoration Commissioner. It would have full administrative authority over the Western rebuilding effort, resource allocation, community governance, the replacement of the corrupt oversight structure with something that actually works. Mara set down what she was folding. She looked at him. You're asking me to do a government job, she said. I'm asking you to do the thing you already know how to do better than anyone in this building, he said, with the authority and resources to do it properly. She thought about it. She thought about what proper authority would mean, the ability to requisition building materials, to establish new record-keeping systems, to ensure that the communities that had survived Garrick's years were never again dependent on a single, corruptible administrative channel for their relationship with the crown. She thought about what she could build, given that authority, in the frontier territories she'd grown up in. She thought about Brindle Hollow. The position would be based in the West, she said. It was not quite a question. Wherever you determine the work requires you to be, Roderick said. And if I determine that it requires me to be in the capital sometimes, she said carefully, to ensure that the resource allocations are actually flowing and haven't been rerouted by whatever new Garrick decides to emerge from the administrative ranks, then you'd be in the capital when needed, he said. as often as the work requires. They looked at each other across the sitting room. The bond moved between them, that quiet, resonant, impossible thing that had been present since the village square, that had survived grief and fury and suspicion and 11 minutes of a banquet going violently wrong. It was not a comfortable thing exactly. It was too honest to be comfortable, too present in her chest to be ignored, too large for the size of the room. She thought about what Brennan had said by the river. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you in that square. She thought about the note slipped under her door. You were right. She thought about the fact that she was standing in the room she'd been given as a prisoner, being offered a position of genuine authority by the man who had destroyed her world and then spent every day since trying to understand what that meant and what he owed for it. I'll take the position, she said, on one condition. He raised an eyebrow. The first allocation of materials goes to Brindle Hollow, she said, not because it was my village, because it was the first. She held his gaze. Because the 41 start there, he nodded. The first allocation goes to Brindle Hollow. Then yes, she said. I'll do it. He looked at her for a moment longer than the professional occasion required. Good, he said quietly. He pushed off the doorframe and began to turn to leave, and then stopped. Not a performance of remembering something, the genuine stop of a person who has decided that the boundary between what can be said and what cannot needs to move. Mara, he said. She waited. The bond... He stopped, started again, in the way of a man who is precise in almost every other domain, encountering a domain where precision fails him. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it is. I'm also not going to use it as leverage or as a claim, because you didn't choose it, and I didn't choose it, and whatever it means, it doesn't override anything you've decided for yourself. He looked at her directly, the amber eyes very steady. But I want you to know that I know it's there, and that's a beat. That's all. She stood in the middle of the south wing sitting room and looked at the Alpha King, who had just carefully, precisely, made room for her without occupying it. I know it's there too, she said. She said it the same way she'd said everything true since the village square, without flinching and without embellishment, the plain statement of a plain fact. Something in his expression opened, just slightly, just enough. He left. She stood in the quiet room for a moment, one hand flat on the 12 pages in her coat pocket. She felt the weight of them, 11 pages of grain records and 1 page of names, 411 of them, the full count of what had been lost and must not be lost again. She picked up her bag. She had a frontier to rebuild. She left Vane's Hold on a clear morning at the beginning of the cold season, riding west on Ember. Brennan walked her to the outer gate, carrying nothing but himself and the expression of a man who has helped build something and is satisfied by the architecture of it. The new Keld Pass checkpoint commander takes his post next week, he said. Good officer, he won't be redirecting any convoys. I know, she said. I vetted his record. He looked at her with his quick, measuring eyes, and there was something in them that was warm in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the warmth of professional respect, though that was there too, but something more personal. The particular warmth of a man watching a person he'd underestimated, then correctly estimated, move toward what they're made for. You were a record keeper, he said. I was, she agreed. And now? She thought about the 12 pages in her coat. She thought about the 41 villages and the long, material, unglamorous work that lay ahead. She thought about what Brennan had said by the river on the second night of the journey east. He's careful, not cold. Careful minds very much. It just doesn't show it where enemies can see. She thought about the note slipped under her door, and the doorway last night, and the space made without being occupied. Now? She said. She looked west toward the long pale gold of the frontier horizon. Now I'm the person who makes sure what was counted can never be erased again. She touched her heels to Ember's sides. The mare moved forward, through the gate, out into the broad morning light. Behind her, Vane's Hold rose against the mountains in its complex, centuries-old mass of stone and history, and the slowly turning machinery of a kingdom restructuring itself around a truth it had almost buried forever. Ahead of her, the road ran west through the grasslands toward the thornwood and the river, and the place where a village had stood and would stand again. She did not look back, but she carried all of them with her, the 411 names on the 12th page, the 8 years of numbers in her head, the cold iron weight in her chest that was grief and was also, increasingly, something adjacent to purpose. The sun was full and clear, and the road was open. Maravale rode west, and the frontier rose to meet her. The first snow of the season came to the western frontier 3 weeks after Mara rode back into it. She was standing in what had been the market square of Brindle Hollow when the snow arrived. The first thin exploratory flakes drifting down from a sky the color of old pewter, landing on her upturned face and on the raw timber of the framing that had gone up over the past 10 days. The foundation stones had been cleared and reset. The community hall's frame was already 8 feet high, its new joists cut from thornwood timber by a crew of 7 builders she'd brought west from the capital with the first allocation of restoration funds. 3 families who had been living in a way station shelter 2 miles east had moved back to the site the previous week, setting up temporary quarters in 2 canvas structures she'd had erected on the south side of the square. The families had not asked permission. They had simply arrived one morning with their belongings on 2 carts and their children walking alongside, and their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have decided to stop waiting for the world to be ready and to begin living in it regardless. She had stood in the square and watched them come and felt something move in her chest that was not grief, or not only grief, but something else growing alongside it the way new grass grows through ash, tentative at first, then with increasing unstoppable determination. The builders had cheered. Now she stood in the snow and looked at the rising frame and counted the joints the way she'd counted everything her whole life. Automatically, precisely, the habit of a mind that had learned to find stability in accurate measurement. "The east wall is 2 inches short on the second course," said a voice beside her. She turned. The foreman of the building crew, a broad, weathered man named Tomas, who had been constructing frontier buildings for 30 years, and had the specific pride of a craftsman who treats imprecision as a personal insult, was looking at the frame with his arms crossed and his expression suggesting that he had also noticed the 2 inches and was in the process of deciding whose fault it was. "Yoren's cut," she said. Tomas grunted. "Yoren's cut," he confirmed. "I'll have him reset it before the second framing crew arrives." "Tomorrow," she said. "It needs to be right before the east wing foundation is poured." "Tomorrow," Thomas agreed. They stood together in the light snow for a moment, both of them looking at the frame. "You know," Tomas said, in the careful tone of a man approaching a subject sideways, "I've built in the frontier territories for 30 years, replaced buildings after floods, after fires, after the hard winters that take the old structures." He paused. "I've never built on a site like this one, where people lived and—" He stopped. "Where people died," Mara said. "Yes." A beat. "The crews feel it. They work different here, quieter, more careful." "Good," she said. "It should be different here. These walls should be built differently, because the people who live inside them deserve walls that were built by people who understood what they were for." Tomas looked at her. Then he nodded once, with the gravity of a man confirming something he'd needed confirmed. He went to find Yoren. The work of rebuilding was not the clean, symbolic business that words like restoration implied. It was cold mornings, and material shortages, and the specific bureaucratic friction of a supply system that had been designed, over years of corruption, to move slowly and lose things in transit. It was the discovery, 3 weeks in, that the Crown's Western Supply Depot had been managed by an official who had been on Garrick's informal payroll and had, in the weeks since the arrest, quietly developed an administrative condition that made outbound shipments take 3 times longer than they should. Mara dealt with this the way she dealt with everything. She documented it, she named it, and she escalated it through every channel available to the Frontier Restoration Commissioner until the appropriate people in the capital understood that slow-walking a widow's lumber order was not a viable long-term strategy. The official was replaced within a week. She made note of that. She made note of the speed with which her correspondence was answered now, compared to the first letters she'd sent from the frontier before the banquet, when she'd been a record keeper without standing, and her carefully documented grain discrepancies had gone unanswered for weeks. The difference was not subtle, and she did not allow herself to be naive about what it meant. She had authority now. She had the king's formal designation and the king's resources behind her. The system that had ignored her before was responsive now, not because it had improved its character, but because the character of the power behind her had changed. She intended to use that power for as long as she had it, and to build systems that would not require a specific person's authority to function properly. Because she had seen, clearly and at close range, what happened when systems were built around people rather than principles. By the 6th week, Brindle Hollow had 4 standing walls and a roof on the community hall. By the 8th week, the first 3 permanent family dwellings were complete and occupied. By the 10th week, she had field teams working in 6 other frontier settlements, the first wave of the 41. She traveled constantly. She rode the frontier roads in weather that the capital would have called impassable and the frontier called ordinary, stopping at each settlement for as long as the work required, sleeping in way station bunks or the temporary structures of the restoration crews, eating what was available and not spending much time thinking about what wasn't. She kept records of everything: material allocations, construction progress, the specific administrative interventions that had been necessary at each site, and what they'd revealed about the ongoing structural problems of the system she was rebuilding. She sent weekly reports to the capital, to Brennan, to Lord Pell, and to Roderick. The reports to Roderick were professional and precise, and covered the full scope of the restoration work. They were also, she acknowledged to herself in the long candlelit evenings when she was writing them, slightly longer than strictly necessary. The information was accurate and complete, and she always had slightly more to say than the formal requirements demanded, and this was, she supposed, a form of communication that was not entirely about administration. His responses arrived irregularly, sometimes within 2 days, sometimes after a week, and were equally precise and equally slightly longer than the formal occasion required. He wrote about the capital's internal reforms, the replacement of Garrick's network of patronage appointments with merit-based selections, the opening of the Crown granaries to direct frontier access, the new charter language that distributed frontier oversight authority across multiple offices rather than concentrating it in a single lord's hands. He wrote about Davon, who had been formally cleared of criminal intent and placed under a structured royal guidance program that Roderick had designed with the specific aim of giving his young cousin an education in governance, rather than a continuation of the education in conspiracy he'd been accidentally receiving. He wrote once a single line at the end of a longer letter about the capital's grain redistribution reform. "I think about the square sometimes. I think you knew, even then, what this would take. I think I was still learning the shape of it." She read that line 4 times. Then she wrote her response about the lumber allocation issue in the 3rd settlement, which was the pressing professional matter, and added at the end, "In the square I knew what I'd lost. What it would take was something I had to learn too. I'm still learning." She sent the letter before she could think too carefully about whether she should. The Harvest Festival at Brindle Hollow was Mara's idea. It was, she understood, audacious. The village was not yet fully rebuilt. The eastern quarter was still framing, 2 of the outlying farmsteads were under construction, and the permanent schoolhouse that she'd placed at the center of the restoration plan as a statement about what the community was for was not yet finished. A festival required food and space and people, and the people of Brindle Hollow were still, in many ways, finding each other again. The survivors who had scattered after the destruction, the families from neighboring territories who had settled on the offered land grants, the mix of old and new that was not yet quite a community because communities are not built from materials alone. But she had chosen the festival for exactly that reason. Communities are built from shared experiences, from the specific, irreplaceable thing that happens when people who live in the same place decide to celebrate that fact together. To acknowledge, however provisionally, however imperfectly, that this is where they are and this is who they are with, and that is enough to honor. She sent the invitations 6 weeks before the festival date. She sent them to every frontier settlement she was working with, and to the families of Brindle Hollow's survivors who had scattered across the Western Territories, and to the representatives of every community that had been part of the 41. She framed it not as a celebration of completion, but as a celebration of beginning, an acknowledgement of what had been lost, and a declaration of what was being built. She also, in a separate letter to the capital, invited the king. She wrote it 3 times before she sent it. The final version was simple. There will be a harvest festival at Brindle Hollow on the 23rd day of the harvest month. The frontier communities would be honored by the king's presence, if his schedule permits. She sent it and did not think about it for 2 weeks because she had too much else to think about. 3 days before this festival, with the community hall fully roofed and the central square cleared and decorated with the harvest yellow banners that a group of children had spent a week making under the direction of a woman named Sora, who had been a textile worker in the old Brindle Hollow and had come back 4 months ago with her daughter and her loom and the quiet, resolute manner of someone returning to a fight they had never quite accepted losing. Mara received a letter. The handwriting was Roderick's. "We will be there." R. We, she noticed. Not I. We. She found out what we meant 2 days later when a courier arrived with a secondary message from Brennan. The king is bringing a delegation. Senior council members, Lord Pell, the new Frontier Administrative Council. He wants them to see the work. Prepare accordingly. B. Prepare accordingly was Brennan's way of saying, this is going to be larger than you planned for. She had 10 days of experience reading Brennan's shorthand, and she understood it fluently. She walked to the center of the square and stood there and looked at the rebuilt community hall and the new family dwellings and the framed but not finished schoolhouse and the yellow banners in the cold autumn air. Prepare accordingly. She found Tomas. We need the schoolhouse walls done before the 23rd, she said. He looked at her. He looked at the schoolhouse frame. He looked back at her. That's 3 days, he said. Yes. We'd need to work the night shifts. Then we worked the night shifts. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the crew will want extra pay. The crew will get extra pay, she said. I'll authorize it this afternoon. He almost smiled. Right then, he said, and went to organize the night shifts. Walked. The 23rd day of the harvest month arrived with the particular extravagant beauty of the western frontier in autumn. The sky a pure, cold blue that the mountains couldn't produce, the light coming in at the low angle of the harvest season and turning everything it touched to amber and copper, and the deep, saturated gold of a world that knows winter is coming and is blazing as brightly as it can while it can. The schoolhouse walls were done. They were not finished. The interior was raw timber and the windows had no glass yet and the floor was packed earth. But the walls were standing and the roof was on and there was a door in the doorframe that opened and closed properly. And when Mara walked through it on the morning of the festival, she stood in the empty room with the light coming through the window openings and thought, this is what it looks like when you keep going. The festival ground filled through the morning. People came from every direction. The families of the re-established Brindle Hollow arriving first, then the delegations from the other frontier settlements, some of them traveling 2 and 3 days to be present. She recognized faces she'd seen at reconstruction sites over the past months, and faces she recognized from before the destruction. The scattered survivors finding their way back to the place they still called home, even when home had been ash. There were more people than she'd estimated. There were always more people than you estimated for a thing like this, she thought, because the pull of a place that was becoming itself again was stronger than any individual's calculation of whether they could make the journey. By midday, the square was full. She was standing at the east edge of the square, talking to the headman of a settlement called Greyvale, one of the 41, currently in the 3rd month of rebuilding, when she heard the change in the crowd's sound. Not alarm, not the sharp noise of something going wrong. The specific shift that happens when a crowd registers something expected arriving. She turned. Roderick rode in on the black destrier. He had not worn the full formal regalia, not the crown, not the court armor. He was in practical clothes, travel-dusty from the road, with the charcoal riding coat and the wolf crest pinned simply at the shoulder rather than embossed across the chest. It was a deliberate choice, she understood immediately, the choice to come to the frontier as something closer to a person than a symbol. Behind him rode the delegation. Brennan, Lord Pell, 6 council members, including Countess Aratol, and Lyra, who caught Mara's eye across the square and made a small, warm gesture that said something like, "Here we are. Look what we built." The crowd made space, not the pressed-back, deferential space of people intimidated by royal presence, but the organic space of a crowd that has been in the middle of something and has paused to absorb a new arrival. They watched him ride in with the particular, measuring attention of frontier people, who assess everything by its utility and its honesty and are not easily impressed by displays. Roderick dismounted. He didn't look for her immediately. He looked at the community hall. He looked at the new dwellings. He looked at the schoolhouse at the north edge of the square with its new walls and its door that opened and closed properly. He turned slowly, taking in the full circle of the rebuilt square, and she watched him do it with the same thoroughness she'd seen in him since the first morning, the complete careful attention of a man who is trying to understand something rather than simply observe it. Then he found her. She walked toward him because waiting at the edge of the square for him to come to her was not her nature and had never been. They met in the center. "The schoolhouse," he said. "3-day night shifts," she said. "I authorized overtime." "Worth it," he said. He looked at her with the amber eyes that were the same in every light she'd seen them in. Firelight, lamplight, the cold, clear morning light of a capital winter, and now the warm gold of a frontier harvest afternoon. "How are you?" It was a simple question. It was not a formal or administrative question. She looked at him and understood that he was asking the real version of it. Not how is the work or how is the progress, but how are you, Mara, the person standing in the rebuilt square of the village where I first found you. She started, stopped, took a breath of the cold autumn air, which smelled of timber and baked bread from the festival tables, and the particular dry grass scent of the frontier in the dying season. "Better," she said. "Not finished, but better." He nodded, as if this was the most complete answer he could have hoped for. "Good," he said quietly. And then, because there were people watching and a festival beginning and other things that were also true, "Show me what you've built." She showed him. The formal address happened in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the square was at its fullest, and the festival tables had been laid with food from the new Brindle Hollow harvest, and contributions from every settlement that had sent a delegation. Mara had not planned a speech. She had thought about it and had decided, after the third attempt at writing something, that writing a speech was not how she operated. She had operated from memory and from truth and from the plain language of someone who had always understood that the most important things you say are the ones you say because they need to be said, not because you've had time to make them presentable. She stood on the steps of the community hall and looked out at the square. It was full of people. Not the polished, performative assembly of the royal banquet, but the specific, irreplaceable gathering of people who have survived something and are choosing, together, to build something out of the survival. Frontier families in practical clothes, children running between the adults' legs, elders sitting on the benches that had been placed along the hall's exterior wall, the delegation from the capital in their slightly incongruous formal wear at the edge of the crowd, like a formal portrait standing next to a working landscape. Roderick was in the crowd, not at its center, not on the steps. In the crowd, beside Brennan, watching her the way he had watched her since the village square, with the complete, particular attention of someone who has understood that what this woman says is worth listening to. Mara looked at the square, and at the rising walls of the new buildings, and at the 400 and some faces before her, many of whom had their own losses, their own versions of the ash she'd stood in, their own counts of who was gone. She did not begin with the things that had happened. She began with what was here. "This square," she said, "was empty 9 months ago." Her voice carried without effort in the cold air. People in the back of the crowd stilled and listened. I stood in it alone, and I thought about what it had contained. 412 people and 8 years of records, and the whole ordinary, irreplaceable machinery of a community that worked. The bakery that opened at the 5th hour, the well that 4 families shared and maintained in rotation. The community hall where the rolls were kept and the arguments were had, and the decisions were made badly sometimes and other times, which is how decisions get made in places where real people are doing the work. She paused. I was told, standing in those ashes, that Brindle Hollow had been a rebel village, that it had refused the crown's authority, refused its taxes, posed a danger to the kingdom's stability. I was told this by the soldiers who pointed their spears at me when I tried to go back into the burning buildings, and I was told it by the framing of every official response I received in the weeks after. The story that was told about this place was that it had deserved what happened to it. The square was very quiet. The reason I'm standing here today, she said, is because I refused to let that be the only story. Not because I was brave, I was terrified most of the time, but because I was a record keeper. I knew what was in the books. I knew what was true. And I had learned from 8 years of keeping records that the most important thing any community possesses is an accurate account of itself. Because when you have an accurate account, the lies about you can be contested. When the records are burned, the lies are all that's left. She looked out at the crowd. The 41 settlements that were cleared under Garrick Vane's administration were cleared because their records were inconvenient, because they could prove what was being taken from them, because they had record keepers, or farmers who kept careful tallies in their heads, or headmen who remembered numbers, or simply communities that knew their own history well enough to know when someone was trying to rewrite it. She paused. They were cleared because the truth they carried was dangerous to the people who were lying. She thought about the 12 pages. She thought about Exhibit 17. The 41 names are now in the Crown's permanent judicial record, she said. Every village, every family, every person who died as a consequence of what was done to them. They are in the record in full, in the formal language of the kingdom's law. And the law of this kingdom, going forward, has been changed. Not because I asked nicely, but because the evidence was irrefutable and the truth was documented, and a king chose to look at it honestly and act accordingly. She looked at Roderick. He was looking at her. That is the lesson of what happened here, she said. Not that injustice is always eventually punished. It isn't, not automatically, not without someone doing the hard, unglamorous, expensive work of documentation and witness and refusal to let the record be closed before the truth is in it. The lesson is that the truth, when it is carefully kept and stubbornly held and brought into a room where power is making decisions, has the capacity to change what power does. She looked back at the crowd. This community is being rebuilt because of that truth. Every settlement in the 41 is being rebuilt because people refuse to let the official story be the only story. The schoolhouse behind me, she gestured without looking, was finished 3 days ago by a crew that worked through 2 nights because the children who will learn to read in it deserved walls that were built by people who understood why it mattered. She stopped. She looked at the new buildings and the new faces and the yellow banners and the late afternoon light on the timber of the community hall. I was a record keeper, she said. I'm still a record keeper. That's what this is, this festival, this square, these walls. A record. An entry. Evidence that something was lost and something was built in its place. Evidence that the people who live here are not the story that was told about them. They are the story they are telling about themselves. And that story, she paused, feeling the full weight of it, the grief and the purpose and the new growth through ash. That story is just beginning. The silence held for one heartbeat. Then the crowd answered, not politely, not with the measured, formal response of a court gathering acknowledging a speech. The crowd of the western frontier, which had survived and scattered and returned and rebuilt, answered with the specific, full-throated sound of people who have recognized themselves in words and are confirming, collectively, that yes, that is who we are, that is what we did, that is what we will continue to do. The sound rolled across the square and out into the grasslands and up toward the mountains at the far edge of the horizon, and Mara stood on the steps of the community hall and let it move through her, all of it, the grief and the recognition and the thing that was growing through the ash of both of them. She was not crying, but she was close. The delegation stayed the night. There were not enough completed structures to house everyone, and so the festival ground became a camp, the capital's council members discovering the particular character-building experience of sleeping in communal canvas shelters with the same equanimity as frontier workers, which was to say that some of them were more equanimous about it than others, but they all did it without complaint because the specific moral authority of the occasion left very little room for complaint. Countess Eratol, who oversaw the Crown's humanitarian administration, found Mara at the festival tables after the formal address and sat down across from her without ceremony. "The documentation on the 41, she said. "I want a full briefing in the Capitol when the first phase of restoration is complete. Not for the judicial record, that's Pell's territory. For the administrative reform process." She studied Mara with the direct evaluating attention of a woman who has been underestimated in rooms of power for enough decades to have developed a specific appreciation for others who share the experience. "I've been trying for 12 years to get this council to look seriously at the frontier accountability gap. You did it in 3 weeks with a stack of transit records and a very good memory, and a king who was willing to look honestly," Mara said. The Countess considered this. "Yes," she said. "That too." A pause. "He's different since the banquet, not in ways most people can see, but I've known him since he was 12 years old, and there's a difference." She looked at Mara with the specific, perceptive gaze of a woman drawing a connection she is choosing not to state explicitly. "He came west today. He hasn't left the capital in 4 months, too much to manage internally. He came west today." She left the implication where she put it, stood up, and went to talk to the headman of Greyvale, who had been trying to get the Countess's attention about the crop damage assessments for 40 minutes. Mara sat with her bread and her cider and looked out at the festival ground, where the fires were burning low and the children who had stayed up past their bedtimes were running out of momentum, and the frontier families were settling into the particular warmth of people who have eaten together and talked together and are becoming gradually a community. She felt Roderick before she heard him, the bond's quiet, persistent, present resonance that she had stopped trying to categorize and had begun simply allowing. He sat down across from her. He had found somewhere a cup of the dark festival cider and was holding it in both hands with the relaxed posture of a man at the end of a long day, in a place where the pressure of the capital doesn't reach. He looked different out here. The same essential qualities, the physical presence, the focused attention, the careful amber gaze, but something in the set of his face was looser, less managed. "The address," he said. "Don't," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me it was good," she said. "I know what I said. I said what needed to be said, and this crowd needed to hear it, and it's done." She looked at him. "What did you need to hear?" He was quiet for a moment. "That truth is worth keeping," he said. "That the work of keeping it isn't only the work of people with power, it's the work of whoever is paying attention." A beat. That paying attention is its own form of authority. She thought about 8 years of ledger entries. She thought about the particular decision to stand in the ash instead of running into the thornwood. "Yes," she said, "that's it." They sat with the fire between them, and the night coming in cold off the mountains, and the sounds of the festival settling into its late-hour quality, quieter, warmer, the sound of people who are not yet ready to stop being together. "Mara," Roderick said. She waited. He set down his cup. He looked at her with the amber eyes that had found her in the village square and had not, since that moment, entirely looked away. "I've been thinking about what I said in the South Wing," he said, "about the bond, about not using it as leverage." He paused. "I want to say something that is also not leverage. That is—" He stopped, began again, in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular difficulty with this specific domain. The domain where the precise, controlled language of governance and strategy was not the right tool, and he was working without his preferred instruments. "The kingdom is different because of what you did. The administration is different. 41 communities are being rebuilt instead of erased. The people in this square tonight are here because you stood in the ash and refused to let the story end there." He held her gaze. "I'm different, because of what you showed me was possible." She looked at him. She thought about the square. She thought about the 8 months between the square and this fire. She thought about the 12 pages and the transit ledgers and the banquet and the south wing doorway and the letters that were slightly longer than the formal occasion required. She thought about the bond, that quiet, inexplicable, impossible there, and the fact that she had spent 8 months learning to trust it the way she'd learned to trust everything else that mattered, slowly, through evidence, through the accumulation of small and large demonstrations, that the thing she was trusting was what it claimed to be. "I know you are," she said. "Then I want to ask you something," he said. Not as a king asking his frontier restoration commissioner, he paused, as the man who rode into a ruined village and found the only person in it who looked at him like he owed her the truth. She waited. Roderick Vane, Alpha King of the Realm, who had fought 12 infiltrators in a banquet hall and dismantled a 7-year conspiracy and rebuilt his administration from the ground up and ridden 4 days west to stand in a rebuilt frontier square, looked at her across a campfire with the expression of a man who has stripped away every layer of authority and management and controlled presentation and is simply, plainly, present. He said, "Will you build what comes next with me?" The fire crackled between them. The festival ground breathed its night sounds around them. The distant laughter, the low conversations, the wind in the new timber of the community hall. She thought about all the things that could be said in response to that question. The practical complications, the political dimensions, the vast entangled implications of a frontier record keeper and a king deciding to become something to each other that existed outside every category that had previously defined them. She was aware of all of it with the particular exhaustive clarity of a woman who had spent 9 months thinking about systems, about what breaks them and what holds them, and what they cost the people who depend on them when they fail. She was also aware, with equal and opposite clarity, of the fire and the cold air and the rebuilt square, and Roderick's face in the firelight, and the bond singing its quiet, certain note in her chest. She had kept records her whole life because she understood that the truth was worth the work of preserving it. This was a truth she had been preserving for 9 months. "Yes," she said. The word was simple. It was not a decree or a promise or a political statement. It was an entry in a ledger, accurate, documented, the plain record of what was true. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is choosing to do something he has not done lightly, Roderick Vane reached across the fire and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the table. She turned her hand and held it. The frontier wind moved through the square, lifting the yellow banners of the harvest festival and setting them swaying against the dark sky. The fire bent and straightened. The mountains at the far horizon were invisible in the night, but present, solid, unmovable. The permanent architecture of a landscape that had been here before any of this and would be here long after. She did not need to look at the mountains to feel them, but she stood before him in the rebuilt square the following morning, in front of every witness the frontier had sent and every delegate the capital had brought, and she did not kneel. That was not what he asked. What he asked, formally, in front of Lord Pell and the full council and the headmen and headwomen of 12 frontier communities, and Lyra with her ink-stained fingers, and Brennan with his quick, measuring eyes that were warm at their edges, was that the position of Frontier Restoration Commissioner be made permanent and elevated to the senior council, with full voice and full vote on matters affecting the kingdom's frontier territories. He asked it in the language of law, and he asked it clearly, and Lord Pell recorded it in the formal manner, and the council approved it unanimously. Then he turned to face her. Not the king turning to face his commissioner, something else. He was wearing no crown. He had come west without it, and now he stood in the autumn light of the rebuilt Brindle Hollow Square and looked at her the way he had looked at her across the ash-gray ruin of this same square 9 months ago, with the complete particular attention of a man who has understood that the woman in front of him is the most important variable in any room she enters. He did not kneel, but he inclined his head, a small, deliberate gesture, not the bow of a subject to an authority, but the specific inclination of a person to an equal, the gesture of a man saying, without words, "Here, in this place, in front of these witnesses, I acknowledge what you are and what you've done." She held his gaze and inclined her head in return. In the square behind her, the frontier broke into sound, not the formal, measured approval of a court, but the full, unconstrained response of people who have rebuilt something with their hands and are watching it be recognized. Sora, who had come back with her daughter and her loom, was crying in the practical, unashamed way of a person who has decided that tears are appropriate to the occasion and is not spending energy on hiding them. Tomas, the foreman, was not crying, but his arms were not crossed in front of him, which she had come to understand was, for Tomas, the equivalent. Lyra was absolutely crying and was also taking notes, which was the most Lyra thing she could have done, and which Mara found, looking at her across the crowd, inexpressibly dear. Brennan was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen on his face by the river, on the second night of the journey east. The expression that was warm at its edges and certain at its center. The expression of a man who had assessed something correctly and is watching it become what he knew it would. He caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back. 9 months earlier, she had stood in this square alone. She had stood in the ash of everything that had been and had made a decision. Not to run, not to disappear into the thornwood, not to become simply a casualty in someone else's accounting. She had made the decision to be a witness, to stand in the ruin and make the man responsible look at what he'd done. What she hadn't known, in that moment, was that the witness would become the record keeper of a different kind of truth, that the record keeper would become the builder, that the builder would become the voice standing on the steps of a rebuilt community hall, telling 400 people that their story was not what had been done to them, but what they were doing now. What she hadn't known was that the man who had ridden into the ruin expecting silence would be changed by what he found there, and that the changing would ripple outward through a kingdom like a grain convoy taking a different route, quietly, practically, in ways that looked like administrative reform from the outside, and felt, from the inside, like a world finally moving in the direction it was always supposed to be moving. She hadn't known any of it, but she had stood in the ash and she had held the truth, and she had not let it be buried. And this was where that had led, this square, this morning, this festival ground full of people building a future from the material of their survival. She looked at the community hall with its good straight walls and its roof that would hold through the frontier winter. She looked at the schoolhouse with its door that opened and closed properly. She looked at the yellow banners against the blue autumn sky. She looked at Roderick, who was standing beside her now, in the ordinary way of a person who has stopped calculating the distance and has simply closed it, and who was looking at the same square she was looking at with the expression of a man seeing, clearly and completely, what is possible when power is used for the people it was taken to protect. "What comes next?" he asked. It was a genuine question. She understood that he was asking it not as a king soliciting a report, but as a person asking another person. What does the future look like from where you're standing? Mara Vale, Frontier Restoration Commissioner, daughter of the frontier, keeper of records, woman who had stood in the ash and refused to become part of it, looked at the rebuilt square of Brindle Hollow in the clear gold light of the harvest season and considered the question. "The remaining 34 settlements," she said. "The new administrative charter implementation. The Frontier Accountability Office. I want it locally staffed, not capital appointed. The schoolhouse curriculum needs a framework. The granary access reform has a supply chain problem in the northern corridors that needs a physical infrastructure solution." She paused. "The long version is about 40 items. The short version is everything." "Everything," he said. "Everything," she confirmed. She felt him look at her profile. She felt the warmth of his attention the way she'd learned to feel the frontier weather, as a real physical thing, present in the air around her. "Then we'd better start," he said. She looked at him. He was not smiling exactly. His face didn't do that easily, she'd learned, not in the wide-open way. But the amber eyes were warm in the morning light, and the set of his mouth had the quality she'd come to recognize as the closest equivalent, the expression of a man who is, quietly and without announcement, glad. "Yes," she said. "We had." She turned back to the square. Around them the festival was waking into its final morning, fires being rekindled, the smell of bread coming from the direction of the new bakery that had been the third permanent building completed, children running the early energy out of their systems before the day required them to be still. Brindle Hollow breathed around her, the new and ordinary sounds of a place that was becoming itself again. Mara Vale breathed with it. She was the last survivor. She was the record keeper. She was the witness, the builder, the commissioner, the woman who had stood in the ash and counted the truth until the truth was undeniable. She was all of those things. And the story she was standing in was not finished. It was, in every way that mattered, only just beginning.